Good morning. Good morning and welcome to UIC Urban Forum. If we could all take a seat, we'll begin the events today, which will go until around 1 o'clock. My name is Michael Pagano. I'm Dean of the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs and co-director of the UIC Urban Forum. On behalf of Chancellor Emeritus and Provost Poser, I invite all of you to come and join for the day's discussion and activity around autonomous vehicles. This is the 8th UIC Urban Forum that's been held here on campus. And this year, the focus is on autonomous vehicles and what I consider is the future of being able to drive safely while sleeping. So let me tell you a bit about the history of the Urban Forum. The University of Illinois Chicago has hosted an annual conference on issues that are vital and important to the well-being of cities since 1995, first under the auspices of the Great Cities Institute, what was called the Winter Forum, and then in 2005, in collaboration with the Daley family, the Richard J. Daley Urban Forum was hosted by UIC until 2010. In 2012, the UIC Urban Forum, a wholly owned subsidiary of the University of Illinois Chicago, with the support of the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs, began, and so we are now in our 8th year of this annual event. This year, the co-director, along with me, is P.S. Sriraj, the director of the Urban Transportation Center, who will be introducing the other panels later. If you look at the program, which you should all have, in fact, you should have two items on your chair. One is the free gift that everyone receives. Every year, we identify authors of certain segments of the theme who write white papers for the Urban Forum, and those white papers go through a set of revisions and comments from readers and others, and the University of Illinois Press then publishes the book. And the book that you have in front of you are the proceedings from the white papers of last year, which was called The People's Money. It was on municipal government finances. The second thing you will see on your chair is the program. So the order of the day is outlined in the program. After a keynote presentation by the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy of the United States Department of Transportation, Finch Fulton, two large moderated panels will follow with approximately 15 minutes of question and answer. If you have when we get to the Q&A part of it, if you have a question, please raise your hand, and there will be people with microphones who will come around who can ask the question, give you the microphone so you can ask the question. There will also then be a second keynote address between the two panels by the new Executive Director of the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, Aaron Alleman. Then after that is the second panel, and then it'll be followed by a box lunch that you can stay here and continue to talk among yourselves or take it with you back to your office. The UIC Urban Forum would like to recognize our partners in this undertaking, including public media, WBEZ, which I hope you heard the announcements over the last month about this event, the American Automobile Association, the Institute for Policy and Civic Engagement here at UIC, as well as the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs. So thank you for your support and collaboration. I'd also like to recognize, before we get too deeply into this, I'd like to recognize the organizing committee who spent the last 6 months trying to pull this together, including Jennifer Woodard, Norma Ramos, Ed Burry, Brian Flood, Cam Johnson, Taylor Long, and Carla Bailey, as well as Jenny Sweeney, who's been the events coordinator for these events without ever an error since in the early 2000s, so thanks to Jenny and the rest. The UIC's Urban Forum, the first speaker today is Finch Fulton. He's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy at US DOT. He has served as a member of the President's transition team, focusing on transportation and infrastructure policy, and with the Department of Transportation as a special advisor to the Secretary on Transportation Policy. He served in the House of Representatives under Congressman Jim McCurry and Congressman John Fleming, and in the Senate for Senator Jeff Sessions. In addition, he's worked in public affairs at Vox Global, devising and executing integrated policy and advocacy campaigns. He's a native of Mobile, Alabama, a graduate of the University of Alabama, having received his MBA from Johns Hopkins and was most recently a resident of Dallas, Texas, and as he just informed me, a lifelong connection to the trucking industry where he spent his youth learning about the automobile industry, the truck industry, and transportation. Finch, welcome.
Thank you, Dean Pagano. It's my pleasure to be here today on behalf of Secretary Elaine Chao and the U.S. Department of Transportation. But I can tell you it is wholly selfish when Caesar Singh, one of the leaders at the U.S. Department of Transportation and a graduate of UIC, was talking about all the research and all the things that UIC has cooking. We knew that we needed to make sure that we were engaged because there's a lot of work that we have to do. And a lot of the things that Illinois is planning to work on, a lot of the things that Chicago has going on, and a lot of the things that UIC is working on are things that we need to make sure we work together on because there's a lot of questions that are unanswered about the path forward for automated vehicles. So the good thing, highlighting my role here, is I am the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy, and one of the things I get to lead is the New and Emerging Transportation Technology Council. So some of the work that we're doing obviously revolves around automated vehicles. Some of the work is about, these new tunneling technologies that we're seeing, and also Hyperloop and things like this. But what's wonderful for me is, by the way, if you ever Google me, which my colleagues have done to make fun of me, it says, Finch Fulton, did you want to ask about his age? So I'm 33, relatively young, but what's wonderful about that is as I joined the transition and as I worked on these technologies, no one else had any more experience than I did in these areas, right? There are no experts. It's all us, just figuring it out as we go, taking this federalized approach, seeing what's working in different areas, making sure we use process and inclusion and coordination and cooperation to answer the questions that we all have. But no one knows the answers any better than any of you. So as we look to engage the research community, as we look to engage the students, I urge you to focus and get excited about this area. Transportation and logistics are already a little under 9% of GDP and a little over 9% of jobs. And that's growing. There's billions of dollars in investments going on in this area. We're reshaping the way our nation's going to move people and goods for decades to come. It's an exciting area to be a part of and something that I think as we look for the research community to get involved, you'll have an active voice and there's going to be tremendous opportunities that are coming forth. So thank you for having me. We're very excited to be here. Thank you. So as we're looking towards these technologies, it is interesting because we have to think through, what authorities do we have to bring to these technologies? We have to ask questions like, when does an electric scooter become something that the Department of Transportation has to deal with? When does a bike become a motorcycle? Questions like these, and by the way, if you're curious, a scooter, if it's reasonably likely to be on a highway, then our authorities come into play. Otherwise, we treat it like a bicycle, which the Consumer Product Safety Commission comes into play. And that's if it goes over 20 miles per hour, and if it has a seat, it can be reasonably expected to be driven on a highway, even if it's not a good idea. So we work closely with our partners in the federal government. But as we look to how we approach automated vehicles, first and foremost, let me go back a slide. As we came in, so the previous administration had done a terrific job putting out the first federal automated vehicle guidance policy. Now, this was a big document that sort of asked some of the big questions and explored some of the authorities that existed in the department and how would we use our self-certification regime to prove the safety of these vehicles. It's great work. What we wanted to do is, as we approach these technologies, we really took a simplified version and just created a cornerstone based on safety. The document, ADS 2.0, just focused on what are the 12 areas that automated vehicle developers need to be able to prove so that they can put a vehicle on the road someday. Now, we did focus on a voluntary approach because it's early in these technologies, so we need to make sure that we have an approach that's bottoms up where all of our developers and inventors are working together with us to approach safety. So we have voluntary self-safety assessments that a lot of our partners are posting. We have about 18 of them focusing on those 12 areas that were on that slide. But this really serves as the cornerstone. Everything that we're allowed to focus on has to start with safety as the basis for everything we work on. And what we've done recently is expanded this safety approach throughout all the different modes of transportation. So not just focused on vehicle safety, but also focused on the safety of the roadways, the safety of, commercial motor vehicles, the safety of transit vehicles. As we look to bring in these automated technologies, how can we expand the safety guidance? How can we bring it all together so that if you ask a question of about one mode of transportation, you have consistent answers and consistent logic across all modes of transportation? So we put this out last October. And so if we start with that cornerstone of safety and we bring it out to lay a foundation for all modes of transportation, how can we start building this together to figure out how to be able to integrate these together? And you see a lot of our approaches respecting and acknowledging the roles of the city and acknowledging the roles of the state. Transportation is very federalized. No one wants the Department of Transportation, the federal government, to dictate all the authorities and all the ways the operations can happen. And it makes sense in a few different ways. One, if you look at things like aviation, those are planes, they're big and scary and they're far away. Congress gave the Department of Transportation every authority in the world around airplanes. Who can operate on them, who can fly them, how they can be built, what sort of operations they can happen, they control the actual operations. We have it all. But when it comes to cars, we have almost none, right? No one wants to go to the federal government to change the speed limit in their neighborhoods. They want to yell at their city council person. They want to be able to pick up the phone and get somebody or go to the office and say, there are maniacs on my road, I want you to do something about this. So all of our authorities are very pushed down to the local and state level. Really, all we get to do is set new standards for new vehicles. At the basis, it's very simplified, but at its basic form, those are our authorities around these technologies. Everything else, we have to work with our state and local partners to drive out best practices and develop these things together so we can bring everybody in on the types of technologies and the types of operations they want to see on their roadways. So we spend a lot of time in this document talking about this and then talking about the standards that our researchers and our AV developers need to know are out there so they can build on a platform of safety based on the massive work that has already been done today. So you can download this at transportation.gov/AV. It's, I think, wonderful work and really outlines our approach. But one of the things that we have to make sure we're clear about how we're going to approach all of these things are included in our principles. Obviously, everything has to be about safety. If you lose safety as your North Star and as your foundation for all that you do, these technologies will not operate as intended, the public will lose trust, and the technologies will fail, and all of the potential safety outcomes we have will be lost. I think you've probably heard a lot of the stats. There are 37,000, roughly, fatalities on American roadways a year. 94% of those are caused by human error. About over 10,000 are caused by drunk drivers, have another 10,000 caused by speeding. Overlapping, you have around 10,000 that are people that aren't wearing their seatbelts. You see a lot of distracted driving concerns. If you can start using these technologies to remove human error so that you don't have drunk driving, that you don't have sleepy drivers or distracted drivers, you can start making some progress on the terrible safety numbers that we see on our roadways. So that's why we want to prioritize safety, and there's a huge amount of potential that these technologies can bring. But if we don't keep it on the forefront, people will never trust these vehicles and it all goes away. And it was just a big paper exercise. So we have to prioritize safety in each and everything. We're going to remain technology neutral. It's early on in these technologies. We don't think we know the best way to do this yet. It also means that we think that when you look at things like connected vehicles, yes, connected vehicles and automated vehicles are complementary. Not every automated vehicle has to be connected. If a connected vehicle existed, we don't want to dictate it has to be DSRC, dedicated short-range communications, or CV2X, commercial cellular to everything systems. We're trying to let the innovators come up with the systems that work best to have the best safety outcomes. We are going to be modernizing our regulations, which makes sense. If you created a regulatory structure where the human was operating the vehicle, it doesn't make sense when the vehicle is operating itself. So how do you update these things to have a more performance-based approach instead of prescriptive about how far away a steering wheel needs to be from somebody or how hard you have to press a brake? We're going to be working within the Department of Transportation itself and with our federal partners to ensure a consistent regulatory and operational environment. A lot of that is working with our state and local partners to figure out some of the best practices for the types of operations that you feel comfortable happening in your neighborhood. We're going to prepare proactively for automation, and we'll talk about this a little more in the study that we're doing around labor impacts of automated vehicles. It's justifiably worrisome. If you're an 18-wheeler driver, you're worried about what these technologies may mean for you, so how are we preparing for these impacts? And then, of course, we're going to use these technologies to protect and enhance the freedoms of all Americans. We want this to be a value add, not something that can take away some freedoms and take away the ability for people to drive their own vehicle. So some of the things I'd like to talk about, and by the way, we'll have a few minutes to take questions at the end of this, but we can lay this out. I think first and foremost, anytime you hear the Department of Transportation talking about these technologies, you're going to hear us talking about the safety band, the 5.9 gigahertz band of spectrum that is currently dedicated to transportation safety solutions. One of the reasons we have to talk about this so much is because as we have this approach to looking at DSRC or C-V2X or future 5G technology for connected vehicles, this is the spectrum it has to operate in. This is the spectrum that can handle those sort of very quick communications that show where a vehicle is, how fast it's going, and where it's heading. The way the FCC created this rule for this spectrum right now, it's DSRC only. This is the first time the FCC ever chose a specific technology. So we have to preserve this for safety purposes, but at some point, the FCC will have to remove that mandate. And when the FCC looks at anything, they say, what is the most efficient use of the spectrum? And so they have to ask these big questions that could lead to, they could eventually decide that some of the spectrum may be better used for other purposes. So we need to make sure our stakeholders that are already using and investing in this know that at some point in time, the FCC will be asking these questions, and we have to be engaged, we have to be able to work with them, and they have to receive the comments. They're an independent agency, so they have to hear from the actual users of the system about how they intend to develop these operations. And this is just a quick example of all of the connected vehicle deployments that are happening today. We're at a tipping point where you're seeing states investing heavily in the vehicle-to-infrastructure connections and some of those other applications that come about when you can connect vehicles. So these are being deployed today. They're being actively used. Every part of that spectrum is being used, and you're seeing massive investments. We only have the US DOT numbers in here, but you're talking billions of dollars when you're talking about all the state deployments throughout the country. So you will always hear us talk about this because it's something that you will all have to be actively paying attention to and engaged on when the FCC moves forward, which could be soon. It could take them a while. We are currently doing studies to determine if we can share the spectrum in any ways safely while not ruining the safety of the system. Oh, here we go. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of problem. All right. So yesterday we had a terrific event at the Department of Transportation where we rolled out $60 million in automated driving system demonstration grants. So one, this was important because we are at a point today where we're able to get these operations on the road. People are being able to see these types of technologies deployed for the first time. Right now, people don't trust these technologies. They're afraid of them. They don't want to see them. And if you ask somebody, how do you feel about it, they don't know exactly what they're answering. So they're just like, well, not good. I don't know what that is. I don't want these things on the road. It's not safe. So the approach we've taken is to work with the partners that are willing to have these operations happen in their yard. How do they prove safety? How do they bring about a collaborative environment that brings in the first responders, that brings in the disabled community, the elderly community, those that are subject matter experts in these issues? How do we bring together every person that's impacted by these technologies and then allow these demonstrations to happen so that we can get the data that we actually need so that we can update our rulemakings and standards so that these things can be legally on the roads in the first place? It's all a big collaborative environment, and this is actually the path that we're going to choose to expedite things and move them forward. So we announced $60 million yesterday, and the next slide shows who they are. It's wonderful because we have different approaches to how, some of these research programs are focused on how do you prove the safety of a vehicle if you don't have a perfect built environment. So automated vehicles need the same thing that people need. They need roads that are clear, don't have potholes, have clear signage, have good striping. Well, that doesn't exist in all of America. And so if you're working in a type of situation where you have imperfections, you still have to make sure the vehicle can work. So we have some projects that focus on that. We have others that just focused on the step-by-step updating of our standards that we need to have happen to prove vehicle safety. Others that are focused on work zone connectivity in automated vehicles. The Pennsylvania project is terrific because as we look at work zones, you finally have something to where, as we've seen in previous approaches, if you go to innovators and you say, we just need all of your data, we'll figure out what to do with it. But when we get that, then we'll figure out what to do with it. So just give it to us and we will probably have some good outcomes. So we've tried to flip that around and we say, all right, what can we all agree is a safety outcome we need to work towards? Work zones. They're dangerous for the workers that are in there. They're dangerous for those on the road. Right now, when a work zone goes up, you're required to submit a fax to the state DOT that says there's a work zone that's probably going to be up in this place at this time. Now you know. Well, obviously we have the technology to digitalize that so that when a work zone goes active or there are workers present at the work zone, we can map it and we can make, using open data standards, we can make that available to your Google Maps, your Waze Maps, anything like that, so that you can see where the work zones are active and we can use that to improve safety. Well, why does that matter? Well, if we're talking about the types of data we want to get from vehicles, that is a proven safety measure. That is something that developers are perfectly content to provide and share. So that's step one. If we can focus on work zone data exchanges, we can use that to build out the trust mechanisms, we can use it to prove safety outcomes, and that can be the way that we approach data throughout the system, so that when you talk about the city planners and the urban planners wanting all this data from automated vehicle developers and other developers, this is step one. We can build out the mechanisms from here. So that's why I'm excited about those. We can talk about any of these that you want, but I'll keep moving because I think I'm supposed to be wrapping up in 10 minutes. Just highlighting some other of the things, we have a number of other transit-focused initiatives going on. We have $5 million specifically for automated transit vehicles, another $10 million for the sort of integrated payment systems that make transit operations quick and easy. If you look at the Advanced Transportation and Congestion Management Technology Deployment, the ATC-MTD program that Congress kindly named for us, they're very similar to the Automated Vehicle Demonstration Grant deployment systems that we put out there. So if you're looking at the sort of deployments, you'll see this is an annual $60 million amount that we put out, that these automated driving systems and connected vehicle deployments will be able to apply to this system, and they'll probably do fairly well. Some of the other things that we wanted to highlight are some of our, well, the research initiatives are focused around things like, if you have to prove the safety of a human driver as they're integrating with these automated vehicle systems, think about the times where you have a system takes over and you are not engaged in the driving activities. Well, what do we need to be able to prove? If somebody's driving at 65 miles per hour on the interstate, how long does it really take them to get re-engaged and to safely take over the system? We've seen previous studies that showed it takes 6 seconds. That's probably not good enough for the technologies we're talking about today. We have to do a better job of figuring out how the human and the machine integrate so that we can prove safety if we have trade-offs between the human and the machine, or if the human's expected to take over in an emergency situation. So we're doing those studies. Sorry, y'all, I'm having a hard time with these slides. How do we prove the safety of these vehicles? So what we know is, if we want to get to the world where you have the safe and full integration of automated vehicles onto our roadways, you have to set new performance-based standards that they have to meet to get there. To do that, you have to figure out how to do variable tests that actually have the vehicles go through these systems, a road test, a vehicle test, not dissimilar from what a human has to do. How can you test them to prove that they meet these standards? Where we are today is figuring out what are those pieces that we can include in a variable testing situation so we can make those performance-based standards. We're here. We need to get all the way over here. And so we're hoping that, you know, the research community can help us figure out these questions on how you prove these things and how you prove the functional safety of these systems in the first place. And we have all sorts of interesting things going on with the different seating configurations or the different things that happen, proving that we have to do things like prove that if you remove a steering wheel, that the airbag will operate as safely as it does if it's on the passenger side. It sounds silly, but the rules were written so prescriptively that if you have 2 passengers in a vehicle, we can't currently allow it because there's no proof that the airbag works just as safely as it does for a passenger side. That's the sort of very basic things we have to prove beyond the benefit of a doubt so we can update our standards. I talked already a little bit about the Work Zone Data Exchange project, so in the interest of time, I'll keep moving because we have some other interesting initiatives. The Karma platform is one that you should be very aware of. This is us creating a data system and some of the information sharing systems that can help cooperative automation. This is a platform that the Department of Transportation has developed and is pushing out to the developer community so we can create some common standards and common approaches to data sharing that can improve the connectivity, collaboration, and so on with the systems. We've seen at least one of the automated driving system demonstration grants is fully incorporating this. A couple others are probably going to, but they're working out specifically how they'll do it. But this is a great platform that is available for free for all of our innovators to use that can help lower the barriers to innovation for all of us. As we look at, again, on the AV, the impacts, Congress provided us some money to look at what are going to be the impacts to truckers specifically is what Congress wanted us to focus on of these automated vehicle technologies. We're also looking at transit operators, and then in a follow-on study, we'll probably look at rideshare services, taxi drivers, package deliverers, others that will be impacted by these technologies. So we hope to get this out soon. I keep learning the joy of getting concurrences and coordinations in the federal government. There are 4 agencies working on this. You have the Department of Transportation, Department of Commerce, Health and Human Services, and the Department of Labor. So hopefully we'll get this out in the near future, but it just takes time in the federal government. But some of the things that we're seeing is we will have an opportunity to engage with the trucking community, with the Teamsters, with the AFL-CIO on these issues over a number of years. One, we don't really know how quickly these technologies will develop, but some of the best estimates say about a decade before the widespread commercial deployment of these systems where they're actually ready to go. We're seeing demonstrations on the road today. But what we've seen with other technologies is it takes about a decade for it to get integrated and saturated through the system. So not making a prediction, you're already looking at least a decade or two timeline before this will have any real impacts. You also are aware that there's a shortage of truckers on the road today. If you ask the ATA, the American Trucking Association, they put the number at a shortage of 50,000 truckers. And what we've seen and talked about is we already have 9% of the economy and 9% of the workforce is already focused on transportation and logistics. Those numbers have been going up. So we're seeing an increased pressure, increased demand as people are moving more towards freight and sort of the on-demand type services. This will probably only increase. So you'll have pressures on the workforce there. This can help. The average trucker is 48 years old, and what I didn't know is the average trucker is choosing this as their second profession. They've already had a job for 20 years, 25 years. They're already doing something else. They are choosing this as a second profession, so we have an opportunity to engage with training, where I have an opportunity to shape what that job looks like in the future. Depending on what business model works out and what sort of technologies are developed, we have functions, we have money, we have training programs at the Department of Labor that we can use to make sure that a trucker choosing this as a new profession is trained for what the job looks like tomorrow. And we can't make predictions on the business models, but what we do know is that trucking is a tough job, and one of the things that long-haul trucking makes difficult is time at home. So can we use remote operation capabilities, things like that, where a trucker goes into a warehouse every day and operates a fleet of trucks, but then goes home to their family every day? Can we use this to make positive impacts on people's lives? And then the thing that stands out in all of these things, whether we're talking about truckers or transit operators, is these are dangerous jobs. You have higher levels of exposure to other drivers on the road. These technologies can increase the safety and the quality of life of truckers, and we have numbers to prove it. So this will be an interesting report. Hopefully we get it out in the near future, but it definitely talks about thinking proactively. How can we engage with the trucking community? How can we engage with the unions and the small trucking workforces out there to make sure that this technology works for them and with them? One of the things I want to highlight that's coming up at the end of next month is we are focusing on accessibility. And we're doing this in a number of ways, but probably the one most interesting, I think, is as we look to develop automated vehicles, we have kind of a blank sheet. They're being developed today in different ways, and you see different formats. But how can we use this opportunity and the billions of dollars going in research throughout the industry into this? How can we use the role of the federal government and the federal dollar to make sure that we're bringing in the engineers and the developers and the innovators actually working on these technologies with people that are mobility impaired, that are cognitively impaired, that are visually impaired, that can't hear? How can we bring all of these people together so that the engineers are informed on the front end in developing the systems on what it takes to make a vehicle accessible? We have a white blank sheet. We can do this. So what we're doing is we've been working with the Auto Alliance, working with some of our partners in the disability and accessibility community, bringing them together on the standards that exist today, the standards that need to be developed, and using that to shape how we will develop automated vehicles going forward. And then, if we do it right, we can take those lessons learned and apply them to vehicles today, so we're not waiting for a silver bullet. We can use these lessons learned to increase accessibility on today's vehicles. It's one of the things I'm most excited about, and one of the roles that we think we need to be playing proactively in engaging in these efforts. And we have industry partners that are on board and they're excited, and we have the disability community that's actively engaged and have been waiting for an opportunity just like this. And we also have a number of other initiatives around complete trips and using intelligent transportation systems to reduce the barriers for people with disabilities to get to work or out and about. So one of the things, I'll need to jump through some of these things because I'm already out of time. One of the things that I think is most interesting is we got a petition for exemption from Neuro, a package delivery vehicle that is still under consideration. But what this gives us an opportunity is to create new rules from scratch on if we create a new category for a vehicle that is never intended to have a human in it, how would we do that? And so we can use this one. If this is approved, we'd be able to put some vehicles on the road to be able to create a new category and get the data we need. And that would be a rulemaking over time. But how can we use this approach to prove out a new way of doing regulations for automated vehicles in the future? And they just need to be able to do 4 things. And you have to make performance-based standards based on 4 things. Vehicle has to get from point A to point B. It has to keep passengers safe. It has to not hit people or things on the road, and it has to follow all laws. That's pretty simple. We have to prove it, and it's devilishly tricky and complicated to do it in writing and to something that people can test to. But this is sort of the opportunity we have to use this to prove this out so we can create a new regulatory framework that works in the long run. So this is going to be one of the most interesting things we get to do in government. The last thing I'll leave you with is the federal automated vehicle strategy. This is something that we recognized that we needed to do because even 3 months ago, I couldn't tell you who in the federal government all was working on automated vehicles. And I was probably one of the more informed people on this. I had no idea. So we sent one of our guys that worked on us on AV 2.0 and AV 3.0 to the White House, and he's brought together all the federal agencies. So there's 34, by the way, which I didn't know, but that's kind of important, that are actively engaged. They're investing in this. They have authorities that need to be considered. They support innovation, or they protect intellectual protection. All of these people that need to come together, we're doing that now. And so we're aligning under principles that are very similar to what we did in AV 3.0, on how we approach these things, but also making these resources available to you so that you know where to go in the Small Business Administration. You know what Department of Justice will do to enforce accessibility compliance. You know how the Federal Trade Commission will enforce how you talk about and how you sell these or oversell these communications, or how you oversell these technologies. The Department of Transportation has lots of money in research and demonstrations. Department of Energy has tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars that they're using for the electrification of vehicles to make batteries actually work longer, charge faster, and be more durable. All of these things, not even thinking through, making sure we're bringing in our security partners so they're comfortable with the types of operations that will happen, and use the research that they're already doing around automation and cybersecurity and all of the things that a system needs to do in a war zone. How can we use the billions of dollars that are going towards these systems and bring them to our innovators so that we don't have to recreate the wheel? We can take these lessons learned and incorporate it throughout the system. So this is something I hope we can get out before the end of the year. You heard me talk about how hard it is to get 4 agencies to sign off, so now we have to do 34, which is going to be super fun. But hopefully we can get this out because I think it's going to be tremendously valuable, and I'm excited about getting this out into your hands. So I believe I've gone over my time. I can end there. We're doing all sorts of other activities around communications and how we talk about these technologies, about bringing in local communities so that they can have the types of demonstrations they're doing, and how we can use all of our partners working together collaboratively to figure out the future that we want and get the potential benefits that these technologies promise into the impacts of these technologies felt throughout the American transportation system. So, I didn't realize I had a timer card right there. I've completely ignored all of that. Do you still want me to do a couple of questions? I'm already over my time. Okay, I'd be happy to.
Thanks for your comments, and a really interesting topic. I was fascinated by your comments about federalism. And, as I'm sure you know, the waiver for California's mileage standard has just been revoked, or will be revoked, I suppose. I want to ask you to comment on that, but I will ask you to comment on 2 issues. One is, how are these autonomous vehicles going to be discussed with respect to pollution and general environmental problems? And the other is, just could you talk a little bit more about the principles behind environmentalism, behind federalism, and what is left to the states and what is done more nationally?
Absolutely. I can start with the environmentalism approach. As you can imagine, we wanted to actively engage our partners at the Department of Energy on these things because they have a lot of the things, they have a great focus on reducing emissions as well, and they're using the electrification of vehicles as one of the primary approaches to do so. And so you have tens of millions of dollars that are going into creating battery systems and charging systems that can make these systems feasible, because what we've seen is a lot of our autonomous vehicle developers think that an electric vehicle is a type of vehicle they need to have the sort of operations they want to conduct, because a lot of these systems require electricity. It doesn't make as much sense on every vehicle to have a gasoline-powered vehicle that also has to have batteries as well. So by reducing those barriers, we can work towards a goal. A lot of people talk about the AACES approach, where it's accessible, automated, connected, electric, and shared. That is a great goal. That is a great approach. Now, we can't dictate that, but we can certainly create the incentives and lower the barriers towards that being the future, because we know, you have a lot of studies that talk about an autonomous vehicle heaven and an autonomous vehicle hell. by having a coordinated approach where we make sure that we're finding all of the barriers and reducing them, and using our funding and programs to incentivize those outcomes, this is an opportunity to achieve those goals. So there is a great bipartisan collaborative effort in the federal government and in Congress to achieve these outcomes. And I think, it's sort of lost oftentimes that it's a better relationship with these technologies than people may initially think. What was your second question? Oh, the federalized approach and how we see that. Cities and states will be the first to assert their authorities over the federal government when they need to. So one of the ways we look at this with technologies, I talked about the FAA and drone regulations. The FAA probably has the authority to assert preemption over any state or local law as it relates to drone operations. Is that the right approach? Probably not. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And so what we've done in the drone integration pilot program that kicked off 2 years ago, we have about a year left, is how can we use these opportunities in the development of these technologies to figure out when is it okay to let a city dictate the time, manner, and location of these operations. When is it okay for a city to say, I don't want you flying over a school, or when you fly, I want you to fly along a right-of-way, or what are those sort of things to where people that live in a city can dictate the types of operations that happen around them? The FAA had a great disaster back, I think it was in the 70s, when they allowed supersonic flights over Oklahoma City. Didn't tell anybody because they didn't have to, so they used their preemption to allow sonic booms happen and shattered windows everywhere, and it was not a popular thing. The technology suffered because of it. They didn't have local input on it and local control, and so the technology's not worked out. That's not the reason why supersonic didn't work, but let's use these lessons learned to include the voices of the people where the operations are actually happening so that we can have comfort with the types of operations that happen around people and they don't reject the technologies outright. You have to have that sort of engagement on the local front end, that buy-in from local community, or else it just goes away entirely. I think we have one more question.
Hi, Finch. This is Anuj Tiwari. And my question is, we have recently grounded Boeing 737 because of the system power failure. And after the death of the first pedestrian by the self-driving car in Arizona in Feb 2018, how the vision of the government has changed for this autonomous vehicle technology?
So I believe the question was, how can we use them and lessons learned from the Boeing 737 MAX fatalities and crashes, as well as the fatalities that have happened on the roadway where a vehicle struck and killed a pedestrian on the roadways? How can we use the lessons learned to ensure safety going forward? So I think the MAX example of automation is very illustrative. If you have 37,000 roadway fatalities every year on the road, people are upset about it, but you're seeing a greater outcry over a machine do something that kills people. So far more people die on the roadways. Why are we okay with that? And it's because, it's people. People do this, and people are going to be people, and so, it's the cost of doing business, and it's terrible. People will not accept that when it comes to machines. And so automated vehicles and aviation are held to much higher standards, and that's a great thing. We need to hit those standards. We need to make sure that we're above and beyond any reasonable doubt of should these vehicles be on the road, are they actually safer? We've actually been working closely with the FAA on the lessons learned from automation throughout the 2.0 document, the 3.0 document, and the work we're doing now, because they do have a lot of experience dealing with automated systems and dealing with the human-machine interface. And we've seen it also in the impacts to pilots. If you're talking about their workforce and everything, there were concerns that autopilot would put every pilot out of business. And what you see is there's still a shortage of pilots. They're still highly paid. They're still highly regarded. And so we use those lessons learned. But really, the focus should be on the human-machine interface and making sure people understand what their roles and responsibilities are versus the machine and not overstate it. And that's one of the biggest problems that we have is the vehicles. There is not an automated vehicle on the road today, period. They're not available for sale. Doesn't matter how they're marketed. They don't exist. So when you see people falling asleep in vehicles, when you see them on the road and taking a nap, that is not okay. Every vehicle that exists today, a human has to be in control. But what we've seen is people get too comfortable with these systems and they abuse them. We need to make sure that in every case, in every way the technology is developed, people understand their role and they act on it. And there are some responsibilities of the driver and there's some responsibilities of the developers. So this is something we're actively engaged on. You may have, there's a stop sign. We're actively engaged on. We've had some events at the Automated Vehicle Symposium in Florida. You'll see more activities on us, but that's sort of the key of everything we have to do because that's going to be, in the short term and near term, the critical work that we have to do. So thank you all for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Fulton, and good morning, everyone. My name is Sri Raj. I'm serving as the co-chair for the Urban Forum this year. I also serve as the director of the Urban Transportation Center at UIC. Welcome, one and all, to being here, for taking time out of your schedules. And at this time, as I'm talking, I see the panel moving in, and it's the private sector entities that are going to come here and ask us a very important question, whether we are ready to buy an autonomous vehicle. And in doing that and helping us navigate that list of questions, we have Jerry Quant, who is the executive director of the Illinois Autonomous Vehicle Association, who has very kindly agreed to moderate this session and has played a huge role in roping these fine folks here to UIC. And so thank you, Jerry, and then I'll let you take over and then walk through the next session.
Fantastic. Autonomous vehicles. Wow, those are two packed words, right? Excitement, anxiety, hopefulness, fear. All of those come rushing into us when we hear about this topic. And these emotions come with any change. It's what we're kind of enduring right now is we're in the midst of that change. Technology is enabling the disruption of a core element of our society, how things move around, how people move around. That impacts us on such a visceral level. My hope for the panel today is that we set the stage for what's going to be necessary to make this revolution happen in a positive way. The hope it can bring and the excitement it can inspire, excitement that will be inspired from this. We also hope to inform you through our panelists, who are expert practitioners, how they're focused on things and quelling the fears that people might have. So let's kick this discussion off with a simple premise, and you kind of heard it in Finch's remarks, is that the simple premise of automating mobility is about two things: driving safety and increasing efficiencies. So with that, we have a great panel of experts. To my immediate left is Joe Buckner, the Director of Product Engineering for a company called Autonomous Stuff. Autonomous Stuff is one of the premier leaders of innovating the development of automated systems within vehicles. You probably haven't heard of them, but they do a ton of work and have been doing a ton of work for a multitude of years. And they're right here in our home state in Morton, Illinois, which is just outside of Peoria. So welcome, Joe. Next to Joe, we have Beth Bond, who's the head of city development from Bosch. I don't know how many of you know, Bosch is a privately owned company, and it's actually owned by a non-for-profit. Their focus is around truly the development of a lot of gadgets. What most of you don't know is if you have a cell phone in your pocket, there's a pretty good chance there's a Bosch component in that cell phone. Because mostly we know Bosch for what? Power tools, automotive parts supplier, and making dishwashers. Right? But the reality is their devices are in a multitude of things, and they have a focus on connecting all of those things and all of their sensors and devices. So welcome, Beth, to talk about that. Next to Beth, we have Don DeLoach, who's the co-founder and CEO of Rocket Wagon Venture Studios. This is a newly formed venture studio that's really all about building and enabling new technologies to flourish around communications, security, and really foster that development. I'm never going to do justice to what you guys do because you do so many really out there things and good things. Next to Don, we have Jimmy Lanigan. Jimmy is the Director of Economic Development for MyJack Products and Lanco International. If any of you guys have ever been to a port before and you've seen those big cranes that lift containers off of a train and put them on the back of a truck, that's what MyJack does. And we'll talk a little bit, he'll be here to talk a little bit more about that. And Dan Zakula, who's the Vice President of Technology and Business Development for MyJack Products as well. So let's go down the line here really quickly. Joe, I think you're probably one of the greatest people to kick this conversation off and really talk to us from a practitioner's level about where we're at with the evolution of automation and help dispel the myths about really what's going to be possible in the next 3 to 5 years and really what's more of a decade off.
Sure. Well, I think what's really unique about my perspective and the company that I work in, right, while you may not have heard of autonomous stuff, you've definitely heard of our customers, right? And so pretty much anybody and everybody in this industry, right, who's working on autonomous vehicles, we've had the opportunity to at least talk to some of their engineering team, right, understand and kind of peek behind the curtain a little bit and really truly get a feel for where this technology is. And what's interesting, right? You heard Finch talk about in the next decade, right, is whenever we think some of these autonomous vehicles will actually hit the road. I personally share that opinion. So in the next 3 to 5 years, right, what are the types of things that we're going to see? Well, the fact that we have, 37,000 people a year die in automobile accidents is absolutely unacceptable, right? It's the thing that gets me out of bed every day and come to work and be excited about creating this autonomous technology and helping all these other customers, enabling them to drive forward the autonomous technology that they're working on. So what is it that we have today, right? We have Tesla highway autopilot, right, which people are too comfortable with whenever they sit behind the wheel. There's nothing wrong with the technology. It's great, right? It will save people's lives, but when people get too comfortable, people unfortunately die and they have accidents. And that's one of the challenges with the, what people talk about level 3 automation or semi-autonomous vehicles, where they have lots of autonomous functionality, but it's not fully autonomous. So the consumer feels like they can let go of control, right? I've sat in a lot of these vehicles, whether it's a large mining truck on a mine site somewhere in Australia or, running around on the streets of Peoria, Illinois, in one of our vehicles that we're running, open source autonomous software on. It's absolutely incredible to see how easily a human can become complacent in those scenarios. And so in the next 3 to 5 years, we need to see a lot of training, right, around what are these systems capable of, a lot of education, right, that autonomy isn't here yet. It's not here today, right? And even if a decade from now we have autonomous vehicles available for purchase, you still have the migration of that throughout the rest of the industry, right? The adoption of technology in cars. People are owning cars for longer than they ever have before. And so we're looking at a 30 to 40-year time frame before new technology like adaptive cruise control is going to reach the breadth of everybody in this room. And whenever I think about that, that's absolutely crazy, right? And we're seeing these ads and people are saying autonomous cars are here and it's going to be here tomorrow. And the reality is there's a long runway for this transition to happen. And that's, I think, a good point to stop and let some other folks hop in and discuss the next topics.
Sure. Jimmy and Dan, this is for you guys because it's not just about movement of people. It's also about movement of goods. So talk to me, moving of shipping containers and heavy products and heavy lift things can be kind of treacherous work and also inefficient at times. Can you talk to me about how MyJack is using applied technologies to improve safety and efficiency within the environments you guys operate in?
Sure. One of the things with handling cargo is there are a lot of disciplines of personnel working in a facility. So you have truckers that are moving containers and chassis and trailers around inside a facility. You have cranes that are lifting cargo to and from trains or in and out of storage stacks. There are personnel people that are driving around in some vehicles, servicing rail cars and things like that, as well as addressing in a rail terminal with double-stacked cars. There's connectors that connect the upper and lower level of the containers. So people have to be working in that area all the time to keep the business moving. So there's several different disciplines going on all at the same time, and everybody's concerned about their own particular job, not necessarily the other people's job. So we use technology there to track and communicate movements of typically other vehicles, so that from a lift equipment perspective, any vehicles that are working in the area of the lift, we create work zones, as Finch was mentioning, dynamic work zones that will track that vehicle around the moving lift point on the material handling equipment. And if there's any kind of interaction occurring between them will typically slow down the lift equipment so that loads don't ever get carried over other vehicles or the people on top of them. So in our world, the migration goes from manually operated equipment to semi-automation, where there are, some functions of the equipment being managed automatically, but still part of it has to be done by the human being. And then you move towards automation, whereby you can do more activity with some particular types of material handling equipment, but you always have a human monitoring it. And with all of these pieces taking place, the move towards autonomous vehicles is kind of important, but slow moving for us right now.
It sounds to me from both of your comments, and please feel free to jump in on this, that you guys have moved from creating a thing to now having to create a thing that's almost becomes the node on the network, and you really have to start developing a network as well. As you talked about, this vehicle moving, this lift moving things around now needs to be interconnected with other vehicles and potentially other moving things, pedestrians, workers who are in that environment. Talk a little bit to us about that shift in mindset for an organization like yours who have traditionally built that, and then sort of your take on it. You guys aren't necessarily automakers, but I know you come out of Caterpillar, who's been doing this for 35 years. So give us a little feel for what that shift is in the mindset of people who are producing these vehicles.
Well, I'd like to jump in on that a little bit. And we're in a unique position, being a privately held company. And for 65 years, we've really been customer driven. And really, Dan can kind of add to this, is that really our growth in our technologies and our applied sciences and technologies has all been from our customers, from the Class 1 railroads that are coming to us and saying, hey, listen, that's where a lot of the technology we have right now has been used. And I think, a very good petri dish of which I think tying all these technologies that already exist. And that's where, being on this panel and Dan really being able to dissect that and be heavily involved, but as a company, as being part of the ownership, it's a great position in which, and I think the transportation and the intermodal industries are really a good start to maybe start looking at these efficiencies. Our founder, my grandfather, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, was looking at this exact type of idea and dream. So as a company, we're really excited to be part of that.
So from I guess my perspective, in the world of connected things and autonomous vehicles and the autonomous industry in general, right, all of those things are absolutely critical to have that level of connectivity with everything that's happening around it. Because once you have control of something, that's great to have a computer control something, but now you need to perceive and understand the world around you. And there's only so much we can do with the autonomous perception technology that's there today. And the way that, organizations like Caterpillar have deployed autonomous mining tech, right, on mine sites, is they actually outfit every vehicle, right, that's operating in those areas with communication technology to talk to each other, so that every autonomous vehicle knows where everything else is on that mine site, so that it can be much smarter about it. And in that case, right, the last line of defense is that a perception system detects that something else is there, right? All of these other technologies and layers of safety should prevent other things from getting in the way of those types of vehicles that are out there operating. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about that is a level of security concern that comes in, which I think we've got some very good people here to talk about this, so I'm not going to go too deep into it, but the reality is, once you have control of something, right, it's a very real risk that someone tries to hack that or takes control, and that's just what happens in this world, right? There are people who are always trying to hack any new technology that comes out in the market.
Beth, that sounds like a perfect segue for you. I mean, Bosch is a very unique position in mobility in the fact that they're the world's largest automotive supplier, and with all of those devices, per your CEO, being connected by
This next year,
2020, so all your devices being connected to the internet in some form or fashion. You guys have moved from a company that builds widgets to a company that not only builds widgets, but connects them all together as well and helps them work to interoperate with one another. So can you talk from a mobility standpoint? You're in a unique position being a part of their city team, which really takes this more holistic look at how all of this integration occurs. Talk a little bit more and expound a little bit more on what Joe was talking about in terms of how all of this connectivity is going to make the entire environment of mobility safer and more efficient.
Yeah, well, I think looking at the different acceptance rates across the different regions that our city teams are in. So we're here in North America, we're in Europe, you're in Southeast Asia. So looking at kind of technology acceptance and readiness is very interesting because, of course, here we look at, of course, we want to address safety as an issue and making sure mobility is deployed in the right sort of way. But also we're very driven by convenience here in North America. Whereas in Europe, it's all about, privacy and security and making sure everybody's data is anonymized and aggregated in such a way where it's GDPR compliant. Southeast Asia, it's all about making sure that the billions of people that they have, equitable access to a system. So it's interesting to see how the different regions are looking at deploying technology and where that brings kind of the time for deployment for different areas. But certainly, as a connected company, the huge horizon that the Jetsons promised us, I can get home after taking my autonomous vehicle for a ride, and my oven has already cooked my dinner, and the dishwasher is ready to wash the dishes, right? I think the real barrier there is making sure that in all of the different simulations or actual work that's being done in closed environments right now, we're looking at how data is being generated and unifying, formats and standards so that all of those systems can communicate. I think, security, blockchain is an interesting technology that gives us the ability to make sure that we are recording every single data transaction. But certainly there's a ton of different use cases for all of the connected devices that we have and making sure that they're secure and talking to one another efficiently.
Which is a great segue into Don. So
I thought I could set you up with that.
Don, there's obviously lots of conversation about connectivity and interoperability. And in all the conversations we have, you continuously blow my mind about what are the things that are literally imperative and in front of us. And you have an amazing perspective on the rationale as to why. So without prompting a question too different than that, in this new age of data and sharing and information sharing, what are some of the things that most concern you that we as a ecosystem should be addressing now, and why?
Yeah, sure. First of all, everybody mentions security. That can't be overstated. I'm working on a project with a couple of friends, one of whom has a saying that I love. You hear people say data is the new oil, and that sounds, okay, I'm forward thinking data is the new oil. His view, which I subscribe to, is that it isn't so much important that data is the new oil. It's important that trusted data is the new oxygen. And the point here is that you can live without oil for a while, but you can't live without oxygen. And everything we're talking about, this transformation of the cyber physical world, is predicated on us being able to use every day in every part of our lives where this world is going. That's all based on trusting the underlying systems that we're dealing with. So we have to trust it. I think the study was in 2017, about 40% of the recalls into dealerships to work on cars were a function of software. Now, that was about $3 billion worth of charges to the manufacturers. Why would you make a car come into the dealership for something that you could do over the air? And the reason is they don't trust doing it. They're scared they're going to get hacked. Nobody wants to be the next poster child for vulnerability, especially in the mobility space where the stakes are so high. And so that's a really basic answer. But now let's wander into a little bit more progressive territory and talk about the stuff that should be obvious but isn't. So I'll tell you a quick story. By the way, this answer won't run more than 30 or 40 minutes. And I shouldn't know this information, so I'm not going to reveal the names, but is a very, very large car manufacturer, has a relationship, as you would expect, with a very, very large rental car agency. They've been doing business for some time. The manufacturer sits down one day with the rental car agency and says, hey, you're a good customer. You buy tons and tons of our cars. We appreciate that relationship. You've probably noticed that over time, we've been instrumenting our cars where they're more and more connected. And that throws off a lot of data, and you use that data. It's to your benefit. So here's an invoice for that data. And the rental car agency said, well, thank you very much. Thanks for stopping by. We're gonna take this back and talk about it, and then we'll circle back with you. So they regrouped. I guess sometime later, they called the car manufacturer, got back together, and they said, that was really insightful. We actually do use a lot of that data, and it's more and more. It's great. And so that data that we use from the cars that we buy from you, we appreciate, but we also collect a lot of that data from the cars that we buy from you, and we give that data back to you, and we think that you use that to be more beneficial in terms of servicing all of your customers, and we're happy to do that, and we think it's part of a good relationship. But here's an invoice for the data that we give back to you. Now, the point of that...
Was it $1 more than...
I shouldn't have heard this whole story in the first place. But the point of the story is that there are massive assumptions being made about who owns the data. Why is that? Why hasn't that been reconciled? And the reason is most people haven't thought that through. And if they haven't thought that through, but we're spending millions and millions and really billions of dollars as we progress in time, what other foundational elements are we not thinking about? When Beth was talking, one of the words she used, which is really critical in the equation, was closed. And what she was talking about was the ecosystem in the home, in the car, and everything. And if you look at the progression of IoT, and Heppelman and Porter wrote this seminal article in Harvard Business Review in 2014 about us going from products to smart connected products, which are what we think of as IoT, to product systems to systems of systems. The progression was natural because when you go from smart connected products to product systems, that's because they don't always work unless they think about each other. So one of the original things was like smart homes and All Scene Alliance and All Join, because people were buying smart home products and thinking they were so advanced for getting them, and then they realized that their security system wouldn't talk to their smart door lock or to the lighting system or whatever, and that really wasn't practical. So you saw a progression towards let's authenticate these devices so that they work together, and that's smart. That's a good thing to do, and you're seeing that happen. The other thing that doing that closed system authentication does is it gives you ability to get security better. But here's what it doesn't do. It doesn't reach into the world that we're going to. And when we talk about autonomous vehicles, that's not a closed system. You can't drive down the street in your connected BMW and make sure that you can talk to the garage door at the parking lot or the pedestrian on the side of the street or the construction vehicle or whatever. That's a heterogeneous world. That is a system of systems. And so what are the things that we don't know? Well, how does one device talk to the other device? What data do they share? What data should they share? How do they go about sharing that? Who owns that data? Who has stewardship over that data? These are all questions that have not been reconciled yet. People are starting to think about it. People are starting to think about what kind of technology do we need to deploy in order to do that. So you're seeing an advance in terms of edge technologies that will have the infrastructure in place to accommodate this. But there is a mountain of questions and issues and considerations that need to be worked through as we go down this path. Mathematically speaking, we're going to get there. The rate of change is getting faster and faster, and we'll get there. But it's not a layup. A lot of work has to be done.
Right, and just one additional point there is that this exists alongside cities who are now mandating open data. and committing to make sure that, TNCs or rideshare companies who come through, just last year, the city of Chicago made sure that they were publishing origin and destination points, which was previously closed data. So not only who owns the data, but who can access it for public good.
Yeah, I was just going to follow that up with, have any of you as practitioners run into scenarios in which you've developed something that interconnects only to find out that you've had to scrap that and redevelop something totally new for a different customer? Or whereas if we had created, as to Don's talking about these fundamental things, you actually don't have to recreate every time. And again, that gets to a little level of business efficiencies and cost efficiencies to move this technology forward. Do any of you have experience around that?
I guess in terms of my background with autonomous mining, right, and who owns the data, right? I talked about how there's all this information flying across, right, and how much is in a mining truck whenever it goes and dumps in different locations, right? These companies are getting paid based on how much dirt and ore and everything else that they move, and the concept of who owns that data is something that, at least during my tenure of the program, we still didn't fully have ironed out. But it was definitely a continued topic of discussion, right? And it's not a simple thing. And it's going to get even more complex whenever we start taking into account, right, people's privacy, right? And how much of my data do I really want to allow other people to have access to? So I could envision a world where, your autonomous vehicle that you get into, you have to opt into certain terms and conditions in order to enable certain levels or functionality for that vehicle to have. You have to be able to share that data for this level of functionality. So I guess I haven't seen it necessarily completely scrap a project or anything, but it's definitely been topics of contention, right, for both my past life, and I know some of our customers have had that exact same challenge.
Yeah, I think that we haven't gotten in a situation where you scrap something that you've designed or developed, but every customer that you apply your products to, you share information with them, but you also work with their competitors as well. So in most of those cases, what you do for them, very little of it they want to do exactly the same way. And their methodology is very different. So you're constantly modifying your products to communicate and connect to each and every customer slightly differently. Some cases it's a little bit more than slightly, but again, everybody uses the data in a different way, and what they want to do with it is different as well.
And Beth, this has got to impact you guys,
Oh, gosh.
mainly because as a company, you're into so many different places that standardization of some of this stuff would be a tremendous help at enabling the technology to move forward faster.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there are tens of thousands of products that are commercialized through Bosch, and we reinvest $12 billion each year in R&D to develop more. So certainly we scrap a ton of work, but it helps inform definitely how we could build new use cases for commercialized products that already exist on the market. So instead of having to completely redesign some air quality sensor for a different use case, we can map the use case and bundle that specific sensor with another component that we make. So efficiencies is where it's at for Bosch, especially going forward, knowing that our core business in automotive supply is changing so drastically because, in a combustion vehicle, there's over 50,000 parts. In autonomous and electric vehicles, there's around 20. So certainly that affects supply chain and the different products that we sell, but we are looking at new use cases that exist within urban markets because OEMs may not be the number one customer in the future, depending on who kind of takes hold of the market.
Let's talk about that. When we opened up, we talked a lot about safety, and we've touched on safety. And the other piece of automation is efficiencies, and you kind of touched on it a little bit. When we talk about efficiencies, we're not just talking about moving people from one place to the next or moving goods in efficiencies, although that's critical, and I'd love to hear your perspectives on that. But also the efficiencies around carbon emissions, the efficiencies around streamlining things, the efficiencies of giving people time back to do other things. Can you guys talk about your perspectives on sort of where you see efficiencies in the businesses and how that plays out in the world you're in, and the benefits?
Yeah, I guess I can talk to what I've seen, at least from a product development cycle, right, in the history of automating all of the things, right? The first step is make the thing work, right? Make it do what it needs to do, and then make sure that what it's doing is doing so safely before you can actually go out and deploy it, and then figure out how you make it much more efficient. And so, unfortunately, the efficiency piece, at least in the world that I have seen, it's kind of that third major step of, okay, let's make sure that this, say an autonomous vehicle is as safe as it can be, right? Or right, automating a gantry crane in a shipyard. Let's make sure that we can make that as efficient as possible. Make it work first, then make it efficiently do its job, or safely do its job, rather, and that'll mean it'll stop for things that it shouldn't have. And then eventually, you get to the point where let's make that safe, right? Let's make that more efficient, because now you can be much, much smarter than a human because you can be more efficient. And so you can reduce carbon emissions. You can start to get really smart about how we can reduce the overall carbon footprint of all of these machines operating out here in the world.
So I would offer a slightly opposing view, not opposing, but just sort of augmented view of that. And that is, so we're talking about, in every element of this, it's all about cyber-physical transformation. We're talking about the physical world, but we're also talking about the digital world. And an element of efficiency is how data is used across the spectrum of everything we're talking about. If you look in the market today and watch how IoT has evolved, when the market first became, the shiny penny and everybody was all excited about it, what was happening is that product providers, by and large, were saying, I'm putting a product in the market today, but with this IoT stuff, I think we need to get on board. So I'm going to instrument the device, and I'm going to stand up a cloud, and I'm going to gather that information, and I'm going to do predictive maintenance. I'm going to let them know when Bay 3 in the industrial facility is left open or whatever. But what I'm doing is I'm creating a consumption model that's tied to the creation of that data. And that's a silo. And while it seemed cool because we're in 2015 and I can now tell when my low-fat fryer at the McDonald's is going to overheat, the problem with that is that architecturally, that's a banking system in 1968. I'm tying the creation of the data to the consumption of the data. And if I want to model something that is as inefficient as I possibly can get, that's what I'm going to do. So what I have to do is I need to think about how do I instrument products knowing that I want to create an environment where I'm going to separate the creation of the data from the consumption of the data, because while McDonald's might want to use the data, the FDA might want that, Frymaster might want that, it's still the same temperature reading coming off that low-fat fryer. And so as we build products, we think about what does this emerging ecosystem look like? And how do I get maximum leverage? My maximum leverage comes from not only sharing the data within my company. I want to think about what does my ecosystem look like, and who are the other constituencies that need that data in whatever form or fashion. And I want to architect my products and my solutions and my view of the world based on that leverage. And I think that with that, you get the data efficiencies that have all kinds of positive effects.
There's one from a systems perspective that comes out of Columbus. They were awarded, I think, $40 million 2 years ago from the DOT. John was talking a lot about those awards today, and it was incredible, their application, because they led with the one thing that every single person wants to do, which is save babies, right? If we can save a baby, we're fulfilling the mission of humans on Earth. And what they did was they tied a system of transportation that they were to develop to address maternal and prenatal visits for new moms. And so they said, we are going to develop a system that tracks transit times, that tracks the user in the system as they're traveling. And if they're running late on their train or their vehicle or their ride to their appointment, then the appointment will dynamically shift the appointment time to make sure that it doesn't have to be rescheduled, and we can create an efficiency within the system and meet this proactive goal of newborn health and maternal health. And that existed along a number of other really incredible mobility, but it's those efficiencies and how can we make sure that they're hitting people at the most critical time.
So from the cargo handling industry, one of the key factors is how do you optimize the moves and the product transitions? And I think customary to your discussion is the data that you have from a lot of different companies. You have truckers that are going to deliver or pick up cargo in a terminal. You have cargo coming in on the railroad. You have shippers that are sending from rail to a marine terminal or something like that. And oftentimes the timing of when cargo comes in to a terminal and when it's supposed to go out to a shipping yard is different than when the shipping yard wants to receive it. So the idea of taking all the information that's coming in and organizing it in a fashion that when a product gets picked up, it gets placed in a location where it doesn't have to be multiple times handled by the time it has to leave a facility is critically important. And today, that's the big challenge, is how to mine all that data so you can actively use it for optimization inside the terminals.
What kind of efficiencies are you guys looking at? It seems to me like especially movement of goods, there's a lot of potential bottlenecks, and you guys operate in one of the bottlenecks, right? When a train's free flowing down the rail, it's good. When a truck is on the highway, it's flowing well, great, unless of course on the Kennedy. But it's pinch points like yours that truly can be the, for lack of a better term, I'll use the analogy, you're the pit stop, right? And if you can't get those tires off in that windshield and refueled in, under 4 seconds, no pun intended, like you could lose the race. So, for what in numbers though, if you can give us an idea, are we talking about 20%? Are we talking about 10%? Do you think that automating this at its most optimal level, what sort of savings could we see? And by savings, I mean efficiencies that hopefully would be not only making the businesses more profitable, but making goods flow through faster, which increases tax bases, and also potentially lowers the cost, right? Because a lot of the cost is in transit and shipping.
That's a hard number to apply something to because it's constantly changing and you only have control over a certain piece of that. But I think I think it's very optimistically there's a lot that can be gained in that area.
Excellent.
Well, I want to join in on that. The biggest problem with that is that we do have technologies that are able to, our Pathfinder system in which we can automate that. We've had our Pathfinder system's been on the market for 10, 15 years, right?
Right.
A big problem is the culture and dealing with the customers that we have. It's about profits. It's about making sure. So with these systems that we can have, Dan said it was, and I agree with him, it's very difficult to come up with a number. But I think looking at if you removed 3 trucks from the road. I mean, I was counting the trucks as I came in from the south suburbs today. It was a 40-minute drive, but it ended up being an hour and 40 minutes. And being in the intermodal business and seeing that. So, I mean, I think really a big part of it is like having these panels here and being able to reach out to government officials and being able to explain that, and especially with the gentleman like Don, where you're trying to integrate some of this data coming in, because there's a lot of data that we've already been collecting. Dan can tell you, like he says, we have it. It's how do you tie it together? But really efficiencies of what if you were able to get trucks to say, you can come into the gate at 2 o'clock in the morning. Yeah. If you're able to spread that vehicle traffic, I mean, I think even the Department of Transportation would be happy about that. I mean, you're not really pounding on the roads. You're not, if you can lessen someone's, I mean, you talk about efficiencies. If you can say, listen, I can save you 20%, you can get to work 20% faster if you live downtown. So, I mean, from a 10,000-foot level, I mean, again, it's really how do we push forward, which I think is why we're here today. I mean, sure. Culture and money.
Say on the
I think that's where the concept of autonomous vehicles helps out. If you look at the industry as it's moving forward and you talk about trucks, I know long-haul trucks are an issue, but short-haul trucks are an issue. And if you can take a distribution center that's going to be built a mile or 2 miles from a container terminal, and you can have autonomous trucks making short hauls to and from those terminals, you can do that at off hours a lot better than you can do it on congested hours and improve efficiencies across the entire industry.
Especially in a town like Chicago.
We may or may not, in the
Chicago really
Chicagoland area,
would
have a
be-
few of those.
Yes, I mean,
From the world of, so it's interesting because I've actually lived through this, right, and watched the efficiency number rise in a very controlled environment, right, with an autonomous mining truck that's moving tech, right, it's moving dirt from one location to another, right, you dig it up, you put it in there, you move it from one location to the other, and you've got 60 of these things running around. And over the course of my time with Caterpillar, and this is all public knowledge, right? So I'm not dropping anything out here, but 20% efficiency was gained, right? Once you got through, right, your steps of making it work, right, get it to work well, get it to work safely, and then make it efficient. And that efficiency of 20% gains is huge. And I can see where that could be even more so, amplified whenever you look at an entire city of Chicago and all of the ins and outs in different areas and timing and everything else that happens with that. So once all this data kind of ties together and these vehicles start to come to life and we start deploying them over the next 10, 20, 30 years, we will be able to make massive gains in efficiency, right? We've seen it in smaller areas, and it will absolutely translate very well to the world of autonomy and autonomous logistics.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. Last night at our prep dinner, Cook County Board President Toni Preckwinkle, in her comments, had suggested her concern about automation and mobility after having a conversation with you, Joe.
nice work.
About her concerns really being about the impact of loss of jobs to a group of working class folks. And we've talked a little bit about it today, truck drivers, heavy machine operators, cab drivers, all of these folks who have embraced the gig economy and are taking on the role of TT&C drivers. And Finch spoke about it as well, to the point that the U.S. government is looking at these job shift studies. But can you guys talk about what you guys see as the job shift? I mean, there's a lot of fear that the jobs that are going to be created are more high-tech jobs and not necessarily working class jobs. I'm not sure I agree with that premise at all, but can you guys talk about sort of your perspectives on that as an organization and how you're looking at and what things you'd like to see from the education sector, from the public sector, as well as what you guys are doing as corporations to help foster that shift that's going to occur?
I think from our side, we're manufacturers, so what we see happening, yes, we do see some higher tech jobs coming in because from an engineering perspective, there's lots of disciplines from electrical, mechanical, civil, software engineers. All of this requires a lot more engineering expertise in that. But at the same time, hopefully we're increasing our manufacturing assembly personnel because now we're going to have a shift in what we're building and how much we're building and where we're shipping it to, where we're going to build it at. And along with that is service technicians and because if you're not driving and touching the equipment, then you have to be monitoring the equipment and have somebody looking at that data from a remote perspective. So from our side, the jobs are going to shift. You're going to take somebody out of a vehicle, but you'll be employing somebody else to do something to keep that going.
And I agree with Dan 100%. I mean, if anything, you're going to be selling more equipment, which is adding more welding jobs. I mean, we've seen, we developed a brand new crane that was released last year, and we've seen an uptick in our production, and our hiring has gone up significantly. Our jobs are shifting a little bit. I mean, our service tech 35 years ago was a hydraulic, he could, turn nuts, he'd torque, and he would work on a little bit of hydraulics. Now, I mean, as Dan can attest, I mean, these guys are working on mini computers. So, I mean, the service tech, yes, it's more of a white-collar job, but he's still driving a truck. He still has a welder on the back of his truck. He has, in some cases, even has a crane. So I just think the natural progression of even some of what people, the old school blue collar jobs are turning light blue as we speak.
And again, as
They have to.
as a manufacturer, we're not replacing those people, but what we've done is we've increased our training to personnel. So the same person who can work on the older equipment, who would never thought that he could address a more high-tech piece of equipment, goes through the training programs and is the same guy today that can work on the newer.
We've actually opened a training center and hired several people just because of these new, issues, not issues, but opportunities going forward. So, I mean, there is a cascading effect of this technology.
So, do you know when cars first became a thing a long time ago, if you bought a car, do you know what else you did?
Retired a horse.
Maybe.
You learned
hired a chauffeur.
Right.
You know why? Cars were deemed too complex and demanding for the average person to operate. But as cars began to gain acceptance, what did the automobile manufacturers do? They made everybody a chauffeur. They made the car easy enough for you and I to actually operate ourselves without having to hire a chauffeur. And so that kind of put 99% of the chauffeurs out of business. And I'm sure at the time that was a tough thing to take. But that's the world. That's the world we live in. The progression of transformation now is going to displace jobs. And the answer is not to say, how do we hang on to it? Let's make coal great again. That's stupid on so many levels. The answer is to say, what does this enable us to do, and where does the opportunity shift? And how do we be proactive in terms of looking forward and leveraging that opportunity instead of being afraid of it? And I think that's what we're going to have to grapple with. So like your training programs, that is spot on. You have to think forward. Every company out there, every board out there is going to have do things like, every board will have to have a cyber risk and a climate risk policy just as a form of good governance. There are all kinds of elements of this equation that will open up opportunities. We just have to be smart enough to look forward, understand where those are, instead of trying to hold it at bay, because it's not going to work if we do that.
Yeah, it's this fear-based perspective that while jobs will be disappearing, there won't be any more to take their place or something. There's a really great organization here in Chicago, Leave No Veteran Behind, that works with vets and displaced workers and youth actually to learn cybersecurity skills. So I think, to Don's point, certainly just like when elevators came into existence, there were elevator operators. Over the next 20 years, it's not like we're never going to see a rideshare driver in the front seat of the vehicle. It will be a slow evolution. And over the course of that time, hopefully we will regulate the automation and industry to actually have some sort of give back to workforce development programs. Bosch is owned by a charitable foundation simply to make sure that we are reinvesting in the future of a sustainable society. So the kind of STEM or STEAM education programs that we invest in across every single region of the world make sure that at the time that we do have every single product connected and systems like autonomous driving up and running, we have a workforce that has been trained to understand this technology through and through.
I mean, these guys have all said the exact same thing that I've talked about for years, right? And it's the march of technology, it's the march of progress of this world, right? As humans, we evolve and we figure out how do we help, right? Our communities evolve, and I think that's a big role in the world of our, government to help drive that, as well as in the private sector, right? We need to be aware of that and help drive that change in the workforce, because it will happen, and it's going to happen again in the future.
We've heard a couple of times talking about working with your own training centers. Are any of you working with community colleges or local job retraining areas? You talked about the veterans piece, but I believe some of you are working with local community colleges and things like that because I think there's a lack of understanding of what the new job is, right? It's what's going to be needed and the clarity around that. But can you guys talk about that at all?
Well, we're actually starting a program, hopefully first quarter, with South Suburban College. And it's a joint venture for apprenticeship on 5 different types of jobs. Not all of them are super technical, but part of it is with our training center and our technology, kind of telling them what we need, and them coming back with the curriculum and the credits that kind of backed it up to also enable, people from the community. We're very heavily involved in the community. In fact, I was just at a breakfast yesterday for the Homewood Science Center, which was a STEAM breakfast, because we do invest. We invested with roller coaster activity for 4th and 5th graders in our community. So it's more than just trying to look at business opportunities. It's about being a good citizen. It's about, especially in the Southland. I don't want to make this a Southland speech, but we do want to invest in the areas around us, and we do want to look at education, and we do want to look at technologies and job growth. Just because we're a privately held company doesn't mean we're just out for the profits. But then again, speaking earlier, we do deal with an industry that is very profit-oriented. So, I think it's always juggling those items that become difficult. But yes, working with the local communities. I mean, we've worked with several other colleges. We've really kind of focused in on our local one. But yeah, it's an extremely important part of our business model.
Yeah, I would say that it's a public good, of course, to work with the next generation of innovators, but certainly it's incredible from a business perspective. The work that we do with university students in proof of concept development, in looking at data streams, both public and privately available, to model movement or to look at what solutions development we can create. That when it comes to organizations who are facing budget constraints because you're looking at this forward projection of the future and your revenue is just not where it is today, you cut a lot of those kind of R&D expenditures that don't necessarily contribute to your target bottom line by end of year or end of quarter even. So the kind of scrappiness that R&D takes when you start to engage universities, and we here in Chicago, we have upcoming next month our Urban Mobility Hackathon, where we work with 11 of the different universities and community colleges to have students do not only public and private data set review, but also generate their own data by doing some participatory research where they go out into the world and either survey a corner and how many of this kind of public phenomenon is happening, or survey actual people, and then in 26 hours come up with some sort of business opportunity that they have identified. We're taking a lot of the work that we're doing in universities down to South by Southwest this year and using that pop-up city that is created through South by Southwest as an active test bed for deployment of those solutions. So I think, yes, it's a public good, and I run an organization on the side that works with elementary school kids in this way, but it's great for business and identifying new business opportunity for revenue generation, for sure.
Joe, I'm going to jump just because of time. So we have 3 minutes left, and I want you guys each to be able to answer this question. The next panel is made up of key stakeholders from the public side of this equation. We're the private side. Is there a key question that you'd like to ask the panel if you were the moderator? And it can be, I always say, look at government as not only a policy driver, but they're also, in a lot of cases, an operator and a partner in operation in terms of mobility and transit. So with that, I'll start with Joe.
So in the world of autonomy, right, the thing that I've seen is that whenever you can constrain the environment or provide, helpful technology around the environment, we can drive this technology forward that saves lives. And my challenge, right, or my ask of policymakers would be, what types of things can you do to help drive infrastructure changes, right, in order to ensure that we can drive this technology forward as fast as possible in order to enable the most efficient and the safest systems out there? What could they provide us in terms of, vehicle to infrastructure communication? What can they provide us in terms of lane markings and digital maps and, communication of work zones and things out to these autonomous vehicles? So I guess that would be my primary question, is what are the policymakers doing to help enable this technology?
I guess a question that I have, and Bosch overall, is how do cities envision their role as an operator? And are the systems that they are operating owned by them? Because there are certainly so many different software and hardware solutions, but they're privately owned, and there's a lot of IP reluctance to give up that. So I wonder, is there appetite for third parties managing and operating to create those kind of efficiencies?
Yeah, so we're actually working on, with City Tech Collaborative, working on this project we originally called the West Loop Project, but since it's not going to be located there, we're going to have to find a new name. But it's a living lab of probably 15 to 20 organizations that will run a test bed of public and private entities interacting with one another to try to figure out what does this heterogeneous world look like. And the question I hope will help try to answer, and what I would ask of the next panel would be to try to understand what's the outlook for how the city infrastructure and policies can be deployed contemplating a holistic view of both public and private entities that have to work together to make the environment work, to make the environment trusted, to make the environment practical for everybody to take part in.
Just to kind of add to I agree with all of that. But I mean, what I would say would be, how can we streamline communications? How can a private company like ours, that we're not that politically heavily motivated and don't have a lot of those connections, how can we open those conversations quicker and faster?
Yeah, I'd like to look at it from the material handling side, and we're a manufacturer of the material handling equipment, but we work with other companies, again, transportation companies, trucking companies, and several other types of companies that all come together to do one common goal, is to move product on a terminal. And what can be done to assist in getting all of these companies together to look at these technologies and put them to test in a location and help it grow and be accepted more by the operating communities.
Thank you. I think we have the ability to open up for a few questions from the audience of our panel. If you want to just raise your hand if you have a question. Excellent, in the back. I don't know who is there.
Hi, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me. One thing, Joe, that you said was that talked about perceiving the world around you. The vehicles have to do that, and then knowing what's at a site to navigate a site. And I bring that up because one thing that Mr. Fulton brought up earlier was basically that it's important in the testing and ultimately using the vehicles, the infrastructure and the safety. That plays into safety as well. What are the concerns that you have with the current situation of the infrastructure, especially here in the Chicago area? We have some crumbling bridges and some roads that desperately need repair. Thank you.
Sure. So from the autonomous vehicle perspective, at least whenever we look at the world of infrastructure, right, we have a problem to solve, and that problem is to operate in the world that we have today, but try to figure out how we can make it more efficient in the future, right? We understand that infrastructure doesn't change overnight, and we can't completely rely on the deployment of that technology. So a lot of the technology is developed, or there's restraints, right, put around that technology that doesn't allow it to operate in an area where there's excessive potholes, for example. And the challenges in the infrastructure can greatly impact the safety of those systems. Take a good example is the world of the vehicle-to-vehicle communication. We worked with a vehicle-to-vehicle communication provider, and they used our software, right, our platforms, the vehicles that we developed, and they developed a little piece of their software as well, that they were able to perform one of the first autonomous demonstrations in Australia, showing the benefit of that infrastructure and the impact on safety, and that if they can provide the stoplight talking to two different vehicles coming into an intersection at a completely blind corner, without that, you've got some driver who's not paying attention runs straight through, right, a red light, and that's how fatalities happen. In this case, because both of those vehicles were connected and infrastructure was provided, the one vehicle was able to notify the driver in the first demonstration that, hey, that light is red, this vehicle needs to stop, and actually was able to actively stop the vehicle before it got into that intersection. And the other one, the car went straight through, but the autonomous vehicle was able to stop because of that infrastructure. And so in the Chicago area, there's a myriad of problems like that, and that's not specifically here in Chicago, right? That's all over the world. But yeah, very much so, the safety and that infrastructure has to tie together to make these systems even better,
And just to add, it's not just the built world, it's the natural world as well, especially here in Chicago where you have sleet and ice, and the visibility effects on autonomous driving systems are vast. So it's definitely a very regional kind of problem, but similar to other parts of the world.
Do we have any other questions? Down in front here. Good microphone.
Okay, you've been talking about the autonomous vehicles and the need for data sharing, and that's just sort of that industry. But if that's going to happen, that means, we're talking now about who owns the data again, and how that must have implications for other areas and how we actually do our data sharing and our security overall. Everything's going to shift. What do you have to say about how we deal with that? Because that's not just a private industry issue. It also impacts our government and how they, plan to interact with this whole situation.
Yeah, that's a great question. The question was basically in terms of looking at how do we evolve data ownership and the view of how that impacts what we're doing. And I would say we start by asking the questions, and different companies and different organizations in different cities are taking different approaches, but we haven't gotten to the point where there's reconciliation. So I think there are a couple of considerations, and then I'll add a huge fear on top of this. The considerations are, from an industry standpoint, there are industry consortiums like the Industrial Internet Consortium. There are industry groups like iLava. There are natural facilitators of standards that make sense for people to subscribe to, and that's one mechanism. The other mechanism is the governmental regulatory agencies themselves, which hopefully are or can be aligned with what the industry wants to do. And we have models for this, like in the financial services industry, there's all kinds of, and medical as well. So there needs to be a convergence of industry needs, government and regulatory needs to get some equilibrium, because without that equilibrium, without that sharing, without those standards, our ability to do the things we need to do are going to be inhibited. And the market will need that. Companies will need that to the point where at some point everybody is going to come together. There are two concerns though. Number one, the pace of change is so fast. Do we have the wherewithal within regulatory bodies and within these industry groups to craft the right standards that can be adopted in a time frame that allows us to do what we need to do? The bigger issue is, if that doesn't happen, what's likely to happen is that these standards will be driven by the largest of the large companies. And if hyper-concentration of wealth or hyper-concentration of resources creates instability, and we have 1x data today, 10 years from now we'll have 1,000x data. And if 95% of the 1,000x data is controlled by an oligarch of 9 companies around the world, that is going to create a level of instability on this planet that everybody should be frightened about. So I think that we all should want to see industry groups, regulatory groups, not have such a heavy hand that it squashes what we're doing, but provides a sensible look forward so that we can evolve this in a way that works for everybody. It's a great question.
I think also the next generation, who all has Snapchat and facial recognition and is sharing their location on 15 different apps at the same time, needs to understand the conversation that's being had around data rights and privacy and why that is important, and not just, based around the context of convenience to make sure that their social networking or their ordering of products and goods in the future is easy and convenient for them, but so that they understand the real implications of making that data readily available.
When we opened this panel, we talked about, I mentioned the idea that this is an emotionally charged and filled topic. I think what we've shown here is that this isn't as emotionally charged as it needs to be, and that there are real issues and challenges that we need to overcome, and that it's not necessarily about cars, trucks, or heavy machinery that drives itself, although that's a very kind of really hot and cool thing to think about. That's the bright, shiny penny. What this is really about is collaboration. It's about cooperation in overcoming those burdens together. And we're seeing countries like China do that from the top down. Yeah. We're going to watch Japan in the 2020 Olympics showcase this technology. And that is all done through collaboration by different means. Obviously, China is a very top-down driven organization, but Japan isn't. And I think for us to be successful in the United States and for us in Illinois to be successful in this national ecosystem, it's really going to demand us to help build that system of systems and focus on building that system of systems. So I want to thank each and every one of you for your contributions to the panel, and let's give them a big hand. And hopefully you guys enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Jerry, and to the panel for a very engaging and compelling discussion about the merits and issues of autonomous vehicles. Now we'll have a 10-minute break before we get into the second half of the program with the keynote address and the second panel. Stretch up, refreshments outside, bathrooms outside. Come back in 10 minutes. Check, check. Check. Nope. Yeah? Hello. Excuse me, we're going to get started with the next half of the program for today. If you can all be seated, we can get going. Thank you. That's the first time someone has listened to me. All right. It's my distinct pleasure to have our second keynote speaker come up and say a few words. Before she does, I would like to introduce her. I'm looking at the program. She's got a full-page bio, which I'm sure all of you can read on page 11. But a little bit about her. Erin Alleman, the newest executive director of the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. Erin has, before coming to CMAP again, she served as vice president at Metro Strategies, and prior to that, she served a couple of different roles at IDOT, Illinois Department of Transportation. Director of Office of Planning and Programming was the last post before she moved over to the private sector as a transition to coming back to CMAP. The reason I'm saying coming back to CMAP is because that's where she started her career after grad school, and she has assumed the position of the executive director at CMAP since 8 weeks ago, as she told us yesterday. And it's been, I think, a very momentous occasion in Erin's life, coming back to Chicago from Springfield. I'm sure she enjoyed Springfield, but I'm sure she enjoys Chicago a lot more. And when we were putting the program together for this event, we thought of inviting Erin because of her announcement as the executive director at CMAP, mainly because of a couple of things. One is it gives her, as the leader for the planning agency, to position herself as to where she's going to take the agency as far as this particular paradigm shift is concerned with respect to transportation. And so that's a main thing. And then, of course, this will be the first event she's going to be talking at. So both of those combined makes a lot of sense as to why she's going to be making these remarks, and we are looking eagerly forward to her remarks. And without further ado, page 11 of the program, please, but Erin Alleman.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sriraj, for having me here. I'm so excited to be here. And so if you're unfamiliar with CMAP, although I'm in a planning arena here, so I hope that you all are, our focus is really on helping communities across the region and the region itself prosper. We're the comprehensive planning agency for Northeastern Illinois. We represent 7 counties, 284 municipalities, lots and lots of local units of government nestled in there as well. And we support our region by really looking to help our communities conduct good planning at the local level so that the communities can achieve their goals and that our region can also prosper from these coordinated efforts all together. We also guide public investments, particularly related to transportation, to make the region more economically competitive. And another focus of ours is really improving quality of life across the region, and that is by developing a regional comprehensive plan. Ours is called On2 2050, and it incorporates a number of the values that we've been talking about here today. So as it relates to connected and automated vehicles, after my stint at IDOT, this is something that I learned a lot about about, and especially driving back and forth to Springfield, Illinois, I can tell you that I wish that they would have come quite some time ago. So as I was thinking about what I wanted to talk to you about today, I really started thinking about my family. I have 2 kids. They're 5 and 8 years old. There's a real possibility by the time they get to driving age, they may understand the rules of the road, but they aren't going to need to operate a vehicle in the same way many of us have grown up and learned to operate a vehicle. And even if they still have to operate vehicles, I would imagine that in their lifetime, that too will consistently change and transform, and it may just not be the same ever again. So everyone keeps talking about how this shift to connected and automated vehicles is going to change our lives for the better. But as a planner, I've been thinking about the question of, really, will they? Right? So what I want to talk to you today about is the critical role that government and good planning must play if we're going to see the benefits of transportation technologies implemented here and across the country. So when it comes to connected and automated vehicles, we know the private sector hasn't been afraid to take chances. New transportation options are popping up seemingly every day. We've got car share, bike share, scooter share, not to mention this added layer of there are pretty autonomous vehicles out there on the road right now. So never before has technology been so disruptive to government. But these changes really shouldn't alarm us as planners or government. After all, planning is really rooted in this fundamental belief that things change, and we can change things. And the fact is that constantly, on a daily basis, our local governments are dealing with change, whether it's shifting demographics, whether it's economic, climate, politics, the financial realities that they have to deal with on a daily basis. We can really get hung up on trying to find the perfect solution. But I think it's really critically important that maybe we take a few steps, maybe they're imperfect at first, forward, and really think about how it is we're going to address these proactively. So a good example of this that I like to talk about is that we as planners have been talking about the last mile solution, and we've been talking about these last mile solutions for at least a decade, maybe longer. So being slow to adapt means that we've found ourselves reacting to private sector entities and these solutions that they're bringing to our communities. And so using that last mile example again, Uber, Lyft, bike share, and now these scooters that are showing up in communities across the country, it's really they've jumped in and they've saw opportunities that we as government haven't been able to address fast enough for them and provided solutions seemingly overnight. But rather than reacting all the time, planners and government should be in the business of proactively shaping the kinds of places where we want to live. So put another way, our role is really vital because we uphold the values such as equity, livability, community pride of place, the things that might not top the minds of business leaders that are really investing in these multimodal strategies that we're seeing being implemented here. And their priority may be market share. Our priority as government is protecting the public interest and making sure that our communities are the places that people want to live, play, and exist in the future. So CAVs and CMAP, I really do see CMAP playing a role as a thought leader in this arena. My vision for CMAP is really to make it a leader in addressing disruptive technologies that impact local communities through effective public policy and actionable solutions. As a government agency, CMAP has a unique perspective, a regional perspective. Our purview allows us to take on some of the challenges that individual municipalities don't have the time or resources to think about on a daily basis. We don't have the day-to-day demands of providing services to local residents and businesses, and we can be more nimble and responding to changes like CAVs. Our regional scope also encourages us to provide guidance on issues that will affect all communities in the region, as well as overlapping governments such as road districts, counties, transportation agencies, and more. Because we're charged with regional comprehensive planning, when it comes to transportation, we aren't thinking about just getting from point A to point B. We plan for transportation that improves people's lives and helps people get from where they live to where they work and all of those other places in between that they need to be. We promote coordinated investments in transportation, housing, economic development to rebuild neighborhoods and bring new jobs to the region. And CMAP also has these numerous resources. We have a data analytics team. We have researchers. We have outreach and communications expertise. And we think that we're positioned uniquely to effectively take on some of these issues like no individual entity, no individual municipality or county is able to do on their own. So we see one of our key roles as providing an objective analysis and about these regional issues to help decision makers improve our region by targeting our limited resources. So when we were developing the On to 2050 regional plan, we considered the potential pitfalls of technology and not carefully planning for or putting the right policies in place as it relates to connected and automated vehicles. So our roads could potentially become incredibly congested if we implement CAVs tomorrow. If, one of the ways that could happen is if we decide that these CAVs are going to continue to roam the streets instead of park in our parking garages. CAVs may inadvertently create incentives for people to live far from where they work. And because it's really stressful to drive long distances to get to from your home to your job, and maybe even if you don't live a far distance from your home, like sometimes when I was driving out to DuPage County, right, it takes 2 hours sometimes. What if I didn't have to sit in traffic and do that? That would be a thing of the past with CAVs, we hope. But if multiple companies are managing our road, our transit, I think the panel earlier was talking about managing our data, right? There could be gaps and inefficiencies in terms of operations, in terms of how we're making sure that we're planning for our future transportation networks. And so that's another area where I think that we need to spend some time focusing. And if these technologies are unaffordable and unavailable to low-income people and communities across the region, widespread adoption may further limit people's access to employment, to education, to health care. So we can't, as a region, afford to let these things continue to happen. We can't afford to squander the potential of connected and automated vehicles, which is unquestionable. For example, we've been trending over 1,000 deaths, traffic-related fatalities on our expressways and on our local roads here in Illinois, and it's something that we were grappling with quite a bit when I was at IDOT. But new driverless features are already being put to use in our cars. They tout crash-preventing braking systems, safety-enhancing backup cameras, lane detection systems to keep you from merging into places where you shouldn't be. But if we combine these technologies with appropriate policy changes, we may see dramatic reductions in fatalities and serious crashes across our state and across the nation. There's also potential to improve people's experience on the roadways through technology. For example, related to technology, drones have been really used to do a lot of inspection work on bridges in other states and here as well. Using drones means that we don't have to shut down lanes for inspection during rush hour, and I know that we don't typically do that here in the Chicago region just because of congestion. But that's more convenient for everyone. It's better for our freight and our passenger systems as well. It's also safer for motorists and workers in work zones as well. And I'll just stop here and sort of say that one of the things that I learned when I was at IDOT was that when we have crashes in work zones, it's not always and often not the employees that are being injured. It's the people in the cars who aren't paying attention and their passengers who are more likely to be hurt or killed in an accident. So as we think about some of these conflicts, how can this technology really help us overcome these things that we know can be problems? CAVs also provide a great amount of data. So by harnessing that data, we can really learn more about where we are and how people get around. With better data and improved coordination between service providers, we can reduce travel times, we can clear incidents faster, and we can just make it all around safer for everyone to get around and more pleasant too. We also need to ensure that CAVs enhance and rather than devalue the public transportation infrastructure that we've invested in. One of government's roles must be to make sure that CAVs in transit and other transportation options complement each other and coexist. We shouldn't see different modes of transportation as separate systems for separate users. And we need to do some work to ensure that they aren't perceived that way either. For example, I lived in Cleveland for a while. When I got my master's in planning, I lived in downtown Cleveland, but I had a job in the suburbs. And I'd take the bus because there was an express bus that would just take me right outside to my office building. But oftentimes, my coworkers would see me standing on the side of the street. There was no sidewalk. Sounds familiar. And they would offer me a ride home. And their perception of why I was waiting there was because perhaps maybe my car was in the shop. But honestly, it was a choice that I was making. And so the perception of only low-income people ride transit really is something that we need to pay special attention to as we think about these technologies coming online and how we think about them more equitably and fairly across our region. So it's not only integrating these various modes, but promoting them as viable options for people of all incomes. The key is planning now to avoid pitfalls and achieve the greatest benefits. So first and foremost, we must be diligent about equity when we implement land use and transportation policies that are necessary for full-scale implementation of CAVs. We need to consider how to make CAVs broadly more affordable and accessible to individuals with disabilities, including shared CAVs and not just the private ones. We also need to invest in supportive infrastructure that CAVs need in order to thrive in parts of our region, as well as investing in that infrastructure in places in our region that are struggling, and figure out how this new infrastructure can catalyze reinvestment. I think from the panel this morning, too, I think the interesting comments that the speakers were making were really about sort of having this predictability in investment strategies really helps the private sector understand what it is that we're trying to drive towards here. No pun intended. So, government has to find a way to balance the modern mandate and adapt with our role as protecting the public interest. We can't be afraid to take calculated risks, and that's why On to 2050 calls for pilots for autonomous vehicles to work out the inevitable challenges that might come with that in controlled environments and realistic trials. We can also make incremental investments and policy changes starting today. As we modernize our existing infrastructure, build new infrastructure, we should incorporate improvements today that will enable us to fully take advantage of connected vehicles in the future. We can advance good policies that are already in place, such as congestion pricing to help manage congestion and demand for our limited roadways, and continue to invest in our major transit corridors across the region. And this really will lay the groundwork for the preferred outcomes on connected and automated vehicles. We should also continue to advocate for responsible and regionally consistent data collection, analysis, and sharing. And ultimately, this should include the private sector as a user of public infrastructure, even as we all remain committed to protecting riders' privacy. With a task force of transportation technology experts, CMAP is researching additional tools and policies that might be necessary to address these challenges across the region, and that will really set the region up to be successful in implementing CAVs, in forcing them to help us improve our quality of life. So we are committed to helping drive change that will improve the region rather than being driven by the forces that are changing around us. So as we look forward, to the future, we would hope to work with many of you to help shape the policies and plans that will ensure our region is successful and really achieves the promise of CAVs and avoids the pitfalls. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions, but thank you for the opportunity.
Hello. Yes, Ms. Ailman, I live right down the block here in Bridgeport, but you have 20 projects you've developed. There's a lot of concern that this 5G radiation is not safe. And we're concerned. I don't want to get cooked like a hot dog, is what I'm reading.
Yeah,
and there's an organization out there right now. Has their standards been developed for our communities?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think that we've seen from our experience with local governments that they're being approached by all sorts of technology companies wanting to put things up so that they can, have these connected infrastructure that's available. And I think that, again, it's thinking about, how that happens in an effective way and how it happens in a safe way. And that's why we think that, we need to start doing some of this testing and just figure out what those pros and cons are and the pitfalls and really protect, again, some of the things that you're talking about, it's the public interest.
Hello there. You mentioned congestion pricing. I'm just wondering if you have discussed a way to talk about the funding that comes from congestion pricing to fund pilots for automated vehicles.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. CMAP as a priority has talked about congestion pricing across the region. So even though we have recently increased the motor fuel tax and fees for motor vehicle registrations, that's not going to be enough for us to build our way out of congestion and adequately bring our transit infrastructure up to a state of good repair. But some of the principles that we've put forth is that if we are going to invest in congestion pricing is that it needs to help support parallel transit service. I think a good question that you bring up is how does it help support the testing of autonomous vehicles? There's been lots of discussion too. If you have these managed lanes, can they help transition as we have this mixed car situation where you've got some that are autonomous and some that are being driven by other people? So there are going to be some of these inherent conflicts, and I think you raise a really good point. I don't have the answer just yet.
Hi there. I was wondering if you've been involved or privy to any discussions regarding last mile solutions that are publicly owned and operated as opposed to privately. And I'm asking from the point of view of maximizing transit equity and the possibility of collaboration between large municipalities to share development costs.
So there are a number of interesting examples across the region that are helping solve those last mile solutions. There's a transportation management association between the Lake Corridor where they're helping get people from those transit stations to their jobs. But some of the other interesting research that we've been working on too is we just did a sidewalk inventory. So now we have data on all the sidewalks for the 7-county region. And we're able to show people, municipal leaders and people who invest in infrastructure that, you know, you have a person who lives here and they want to get here. But if they are only able to take the sidewalk, for instance, you know, maybe the only way for them to get there is here. And so as we look at the data we have, it's really about sort of highlighting these gaps that we have in the data as you're speaking of here and figuring out ways to start discussing those potential solutions.
Hi, thank you for your speech. I actually have a question. I know you mentioned achieving equity and making CAVs accessible to everyone. How do you think that can be achieved here in Chicago?
That's a great question. And I think that that is going to require a lot of forethought and just, you know, commitment from folks who are working in this industry and really understanding that the role of government is about achieving equity or making sure that all of the residents across the region are taken care of. And so whether that's, you know, from the initial discussions of these pilots, where the pilots are happening, looking at the data and realizing that maybe the pilot that you had didn't encapsulate sort of a number of user groups that you necessarily needed to get to. Oftentimes, as we're looking at the data that we have, we do a lot of, we just closed a travel survey. You know, we had to look at specific groups to make sure that we were understanding the travel patterns of different people who live in different places, who come from different ethnic backgrounds. So, you know, there is a lot of work that needs to be done, and I think that it all starts fundamentally with understanding the data and making sure that we've got the right information from which to make our decisions on.
Hi, I just wanted to follow up on that because I expect that many of these pilot programs are going to begin with freight in the region, and they will generate quite a bit of data. Do you have anything in place for how you might receive data and you know, sort of start putting up the structure for actually doing the analysis?
Yeah, great question. You know, there is, the University of Maryland has a CAT lab, and I'm not sure exactly what the acronym stands for, but they've been really integral in sort of testing out and taking on some of these larger data sets that states are then working with to help them understand how to utilize this data. CMAP has a long history of modeling and data analysis as well, and so, you know, I think it's that infrastructure that we have in terms of our staff understanding where this is, but at the end of the day, I think what the panel was talking about earlier is that we need to make sure that it's not sort of just 9 or 5 or whatever that number is that we're thinking about sort of the disbursement of this data, making sure it's secure, but also making sure that we aren't sort of building these monopolies where we're giving our data away and not understanding some of the repercussions as to how it's being used. So, still too early, I think, to get into the details. But on the freight side of things, there's a lot of good data being collected already, and it's just digging in and figuring out that, again, last mile really seems to be critical. No, no, not right now. I mean, I think right now a lot of the data collection is going on in some of these test beds and some of those national test pilots for automated and testing vehicles. There's a big one in California. There's a big one in Ann Arbor, Michigan. There's some talks about working with a coordinated series of universities across Illinois and developing a place where that could happen. But no, CMAP wouldn't probably. Yes, we'd be happy to be a part of those conversations.
So I think the creation of CMAP was a major step forward for the region. We had multiple agencies before that didn't coordinate. But the problem for CMAP is it doesn't have enough money and it doesn't have enough power. In the Twin Cities, they control part of the sales tax money and are able to redistribute it to the communities doing the best work for the region. You can put out a map for 2020 or 2050, but you can't compel any community, much less the private sector, to adhere to the map. Are there plans with some of the, and the only agency that really has any power in the region is the state legislature. Is there any plan with the state legislator or the new governor to give CMAP more authority so that it could be more forceful in both the transportation area and the other areas of planning?
Well, I would love to vote for you. I think that is a challenge that I knew that I was walking into, right? Making change through collaboration and consensus building is very challenging, especially when local land use authority is very local. We do a lot of work through our local technical assistance program to help communities sort of educate them on some of the benefits of these bigger, broader regional goals. But I would say some tangible stuff that we do have control over is the prioritization of the transportation funding that comes to our region. And we've recently realigned a number of those metrics to meet the goals of Onto 2050. And so we're asking local councils across the region of mayors and councils of governments to start thinking about how they can incorporate these regional priorities as they program their transportation funding efforts. And we have a shared regional pool of funds right now, too, that we have programmed and are in the process of being approved, where we have really transformed the way that we're measuring and evaluating the return on investment that those projects will bring, with an eye towards bringing across some of those regional things. So it's small steps, but I think in terms of how funding has been distributed across the region, it's a big change. So, well, one more question.
Hello, my name's Troy Hernandez. I graduated from here, 6 years ago, studying transportation and statistics and artificial intelligence. The head of Facebook AI is tied into all the deep learning that drives a lot of this, the computer vision that's required for self-driving cars. And I think it's their opinion, and the guy who runs Google's self-driving cars, that it's really difficult to do this, and we're not going to see the self-driving cars in the next 20 years. But perhaps traveling at a lower speed, that might be possible. Secondly, I volunteer in the community here in Pilsen doing environmental justice work and riding a bicycle and being an advocate for that. And it seems there's an opportunity to combine bicycle greenways and self-driving cars at 20 miles an hour. I don't know if that's a conversation that's going on anywhere that you've heard of, but it seems like a really good opportunity to advance this sort of vision.
Yeah, I think that's an idea and concept that's new to me, but as we think about automation, there is already some automated vehicles, I would say. Anybody flown anywhere this year? You were on an airplane, and probably for more than half of your trip, nobody was flying it. An automated system was flying it, right? So, but that was on a long-haul trip. So perhaps as we think about this, maybe it's not about the city center structure. It's about the long-haul sort of freight ideas and those paths that are relatively conflict-free. But excellent points, and I would be happy to talk to you more. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you and look forward to working with UIC and the community in the future.
Thank you, Aaron. And it's my great pleasure to welcome the next panel onto the stage. We have a distinguished set of panelists sitting up here. Please come and join us on stage. And the next panel is going to be moderated by Mary Wisniewski, a Chicago fixture in the journalism side for the better part of 25 years, more recently affiliated with the Tribune, prior to that with Reuters and the Sun-Times. She also has a weekly hit on WBBM radio, which is not on the program, but I'm plugging it for her as they settle down. I'm equally anxious and eager to hear what this next panel is going to be reflecting on the topic of the day from their vantage positions leading various agencies in the region. Over to you, Mary.
Okay, thanks very much. Wanted to say that I love the title of this conference, Are We There Yet?, which is something that I hear all the time from the backseat of my car. And usually what I say is, no, we're not, but it's time to get ready. It's time to put your shoes on and brush the crumbs off the seat. And I think that that's what policymakers are doing right now. We're not quite there yet, despite that we do have some autonomous features in some vehicles. But what we're trying to do right now is to get ready and to be prepared for the future that's coming. We have quite a panel today, and we're going to have lots of questions. We'll start with the introductions and then go right into them. On our far stage left here, we have John Yonan, who's the superintendent of Cook County Department of Transportation and Highways. Next to him, we have Leanne Redden, executive director of the Regional Transportation Authority. And then we have John Bazek, who's the program development engineer for the Illinois Department of Transportation. We have president of the CTA, Dorval Carter. And then right next to me here is Amy Lee, who is the Senior Manager of Strategic Planning for the Illinois Tollway. So all people who are deeply involved in how we get around and are thinking about this issue that's coming up. And we're going to start on the transit side, and because our panel is going to look at, what kind of concerns are there. So I wanted to go ahead and start with the transit side. Leanne and Dorval and John Yonan, is there a concern about the introduction of autonomous vehicles? Is there a concern that there could be a displacement of transit because of these vehicles? And Dorval, do you want to start?
Okay. Yes, there's a concern. I think it is a concern that's not unlike the concerns that we've had about ride-hailing companies and scooters and car sharing and the other things, the other technologies that are now starting to impact mobility in the city as a whole. I think the point that I keep making, and I think the point that we really stress as a broader policy conversation, is that no matter how you deal with all the other mobility options that come into the city, you're still going to have to deal with the broader process of how do you actually efficiently move people through a dense urban population like the city of Chicago. And public transit, because of our capacity, if nothing else, will be a part of that conversation. I like to use an anecdote that people have heard me say, that if you took all the people in Willis Towers and you put them all into automated vehicles and had them all take automated vehicles to work, it would take 7 hours for them all to get to the building. That gives you a sense of sort of the magnitude of the problem that we're talking about, and the reason why public transportation still needs to be a part of that conversation.
Okay, thank you. Leanne, wanted to ask you about that, but also how you see autonomous vehicles possibly working as part of a total solution that includes transit.
So I think CAVs present, both challenges and opportunities. I think that it's also not, when I look at it from a regional transit perspective, it's not one size fits all. I think there's a real risk of disruption and challenges in the downtown urban core. Aaron mentioned sort of this, platooned, empty vehicles sort of patrolling streets and just clogging the streets further. And nothing, as Dorval said, gets that throughput that public transportation can get. And so I think public transportation needs to be recognized as the backbone, whereby this whole extra collection of mobility options around the region get to exist with. Because if we sort of turn off the transit thing or ignore the transit piece and turn our backs on sort of the billions of dollars of investment. You know, we've sort of shot ourselves in the foot, if you will, because all the platoons in autonomous vehicles can't work. But in a suburban environment, Aaron also mentioned sort of that last mile connection. I think the concept, and this is where some of the autonomous space is really being actively tested right now in, you know, smaller, low density, lower capacity vehicles, providing connections and sort of circulation maybe to either a more of a mainline feeder bus service, or train service for that matter. So I think that we shouldn't think about it as one size fits all. I think the key piece for us to think about, though, is to lean in on the policy conversations that we're shaping that future, that we are at the table. We're not saying that autonomous and connect, because we get to take the benefits of some of those technology advantages too. But we need to be part of that conversation. So from a equity, from a regulatory, and from just a basic organizational standpoint, that, you know, we're at the table thinking through those big challenges.
Thank you. And John, could you talk a little bit about what the county is thinking about how this can be integrated with transit?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, and I really appreciate the panel that's here. The diversity on the Cook County, you know, has basically 1,600 lane miles of roadways. And so a few years back, President Preckwinkle, who's, you know, one of the chairwoman of this UIC Forum, really had looked at the entire transportation network when she became county board chair and said there needs to be a way that the road building industry embraces transit, that she truly believed in transit. And so when we came up with our long-range transportation plan, we really saw a space for the road building industry to be able to play a role in transit. As Leanne said, as kind of the executive director of the Regional, you know, Transit Administration Authority, there is opportunities for there to integrate the different modes of transit, and that tends to be at times maybe right now a private sector opportunity that we talked about, the autonomous vehicles, but also a model that government should be at the table trying to fund. And so we have saw a couple opportunities. I know a couple questions came up earlier about where are we in that space. Cook County is working closely with Bedford Park. Bedford Park has an incredible industrial campus. It's vast, but it's also served by the CTA, by Metra, and by PACE. But to be able to use that transit and actually navigate through that industrial park truly became a challenge for some of the folks to have transit as a viable option. So a number of folks are actually driving to their jobs. And so in working closely with them, we helped fund a grant where they went out and surveyed some of the businesses and some of the people who work at those businesses as to if transit was an option for them, what was the challenges with it. And we really saw a space there where we could be able to, as again, the road building industry, be able to support a private entity to look at possibly CAV. Again, right now, some smart technology that they're actually developing out there. But that is an ongoing pilot that has been taking place the last couple of years in the village of Bedford Park.
Okay, thanks, John. To turn that around, we talked about the possible fears about AVs, but I also wanted to talk about what are some ways that it can reduce congestion in the future. And I wanted to ask our road people here, Amy and John Basic and John Yonan again, talk about what kinds of conversations are you having about how this might help cure some congestion on your roads?
Yeah. I'll jump right in. So, you know, when we, at the tollway, when we think about CAV technologies and their development, we sort of see that as part of a ongoing spectrum of adopting technology into our operations when it makes sense, when it presents safety solutions for us. We have a test bed on I-90 called Smart Road, and we see that as a technology that's here today that allows us to really maximize the use of the pavement that we have out there, right? So we have a wide inside shoulder that allows pace to get by congestion. We also use that too to create workarounds if we have an incident on our roadway or on our main line. So CAV Technologies presents sort of that next generation solution. If we don't have to continue investing in these gantries that go over our road, and a future smart vehicle has a panel inside of it that tells the vehicle which lane to get into, that presents sort of the next generation on being able to alleviate the congestion around those.
Have you talked about the idea of having separate lanes for AVs, or is there? Or is that...
That's, honestly, that's part of a broader policy discussion I think that we need to have as a region. I think the tollway is open to those ideas, and if we believe that that's something that we should be moving towards, given new policies, that's definitely something we want to be open to.
Okay, thank you, John. John Basic, can you talk about what is IDOT doing as far as incorporating this technology, or just talking about how this technology is going to work with your roads?
Yeah, as far as IDOT, we have, with the previous administration, welcomed autonomous vehicles to Illinois, and so we are fairly early in that process, but we are looking to partner and have partnered with industry to develop start thinking about developing pilot programs within the state of Illinois to allow the expansion and more studying of autonomous vehicle technologies. There's a couple of, through Autonomous Illinois, there's some partnerships that have been developed, I think, with some testing in Itasca, as well as some stuff in Northeast Illinois. And I think one of the things that we can really kind of take advantage of, and has been talked about quite a bit, is the freight component, because certainly Illinois is the center of the crossroads of the United States from a freight perspective, from a transportation perspective, and with the amount of inland ports and freight intermodal facilities that there's potentially some real opportunities there to work with autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles, for moving goods within those facilities, which could potentially be a launching pad for a lot more discussion and expansion of freight movement even outside the confines of those intermodal facilities. So I think that the policy discussions, though, are something that we are wanting to be part of and are getting our feet wet in that arena. We want to work with CMAP, who has some great insights on some of the challenges and the pitfalls of autonomous vehicles, because at the end of the day, we need to figure out a way with industry driving that development of autonomous and connected vehicles. What is the platform going to look like? IDOT, as an implementer, is always faced with challenges regarding trying to implement something that is the current technology today, but it takes a while to get to that point, and by the time sometimes we want to implement something, it's already past technology. So we want to find that connection with the industry and our partners to develop things that are going to be lasting and compatible with multiple modes or multiple strategies and technologies, and be able to evolve with that. So we're really looking forward to be part of that process and make sure that we can integrate that stuff. And right now is actually an amazing time for the department, because with the increase in the gas tax, we may be able to address a lot of our basic condition stuff is what we've been trying to wrap our arms around. But now with sustainable revenue sources, this maybe puts us in a better position to start looking a little bit more forward in integrating technologies in some of the infrastructure improvements that we're going to make.
Hey, thanks, John. John, you talked a little bit about this with the Bedford Park project, but what are some ways that Cook County sees as how this technology can alleviate congestion on your roads? And is this something that you're investing in as far as technology in the roads?
We are. Actually, I know Lake County wasn't asked to be a part of it, but they've got their passage system, and one of the gentlemen who operate the system and I were just chatting in the back. And so there's models, and where we are right now is when you actually come up to a traffic signal, look at the box. Look whose sticker's on there, because there's 4 jurisdictions of people who are responsible for those intersections, and you can't even freely flow down certain routes if you're not on a state route system, which tends to, and as you said, John, you guys have come a long way, but we're still telling traffic how to go and when to start and stop. But with the technology basically having that free flow ability, we no longer need to have it about jurisdictional responsibilities. If my road needs to travel faster than a municipal road or a county or a state road. So that type of discussions have been a real, I think, important kind of start to having government work together. And I think, again, John will tell you that, we're all pushing for the Eisenhower Expressway to be reconstructed. North Avenue, Cermak, Roosevelt, these are corridors that are being looked at where some of this technology under John's leadership has been discussed with some of the local agencies where we've got to figure this out. And we welcome, again, the private sector to be able to look at how when that expressway is under construction, those corridors, regardless of whose jurisdiction is, are going to be able to flow some of that traffic efficiently. So we've got a few models, but some real low-hanging fruit that we think we can just jump in as Cook County and in that case, partner with DuPage County and be the lead on making sure that reconstruction will have minimal impact on some of the locals.
Hey, I'm glad that the gas tax came up because one of the things that's talked about a lot with autonomous technology is that it's not going to take gas. Yeah. It's going to be electric. And I wanted to ask Leanne about do you have some concerns or some ideas about how the user fee structure is going to change and how is that going to affect funding for transit or for other things in the region when AVs become more common?
I don't think we have any concern in the very immediate future. The state capital program that just passed, it's got a 5-year bond component. We think we'll be good for the next 5 years. Okay. We've got a lot to do and a lot of things to spend those dollars on. But it is going to change over time. I think there's been a lot of conversation about vehicle miles traveled as a different pricing structure. And I think nationally we know that that's probably the direction that revenue generation is going to have to go. We do it on the tollway essentially already. We pay tolls based on how far we travel and where we go. So these aren't new concepts. We have to do a better job selling and explaining kind of what it is. But I think the other opportunity that I see in this sort of pricing and funding conversation is the opportunity to keep the conversation going about congestion pricing, some of these other tools that could be used to do two things. One, potentially generate some revenue, but two, also manage behavior and ultimately congestion. And I think it keeps those conversations kind of fit into this broader conversation about sort of the technology and the implementation of some of these connected autonomous vehicles.
Okay, connecting with that, thank you. Amy, do you see a possibility in the future of, right now, trucks are, of course, the heaviest payers on the tollway. Do you see any kind of future where autonomous trucks would be a less heavy payer because they pose less of a threat?
They still carry heavy weights, okay. Right? And so they still put a lot of impact on our pavement. So I don't know that that's necessarily going to change the pay structure. We often look at what is the life cycle of our pavement and things like that. And so weights of the trucks will continue to be the weights of the trucks.
Do you see AV technology as changing your pricing structure at all?
I see that it could present some very broad opportunities to talk about policy in a new way, just sort of along the lines of congestion pricing and things like that. But I think that the tollway sits as an implementation agency. We don't set policy for these sorts of things. So when we look at the technologies that we employ, we certainly want to adopt technology that won't go obsolete, that will be flexible to sort of accommodate changes in policy. But I don't see that change coming from within the tollway.
Okay, thank you. And moving back to public transit, one of the things that is possible from AV technology is not only putting maybe more of these cars on the highway, but maybe affecting the way transit is operated. Do you see AV technology being used in any of your trains or in any of the short-run buses?
Yeah, I do think that there are possibilities for AV to eventually move into the public transit space. I think that the technology itself hasn't evolved to the point yet where I think that would be a practical conversation. The question that it will also raise will be what size vehicles should we be applying it to? I mean, currently we operate 40-foot buses. There are demonstrations in other parts of the world where they are using AVs for public transportation in a much smaller vehicle than what we currently use. I think that, how the public will react to AV technology for public transportation is a big part of that conversation. But, to some degree, if you look at our people mover at the airports and things of that nature, we're already sort of familiar with that concept in very short, periods or places of usage. Why that couldn't ultimately expand itself to much broader application, I think, is an interesting discussion. I think that the real question from my perspective will sort of be what will be the interaction with the customers with that kind of technology, and how would we still provide the customers with the support that they need to utilize our service with that kind of technology. I think there are a lot of people who would be more a little bit concerned about being on a crowded train and not having a CTA employee on there if something were to happen that created an issue. So I think we still have to work through those types of issues, but I think it's definitely a part of what the future holds in public transportation, and it will play a role in sort of what we do and how we sort of develop our policies as we go forward, both in terms of labor, but also in terms of the equipment that we use.
I wanted to, following up on that, could it free up some labor who are currently, driving to do things like customer service?
That's an interesting conversation. A lot of people ask me, well, does this mean that, people will lose jobs? My closest parallel to that, in terms of the experience within CTA, was when we went from taking cash and tokens to a cashless fare media system. We used to have these people called ticket agents who would sit in their booth all day and who would collect cash and give you a token that would allow you to ride on CTA. Those people today are called customer service agents. And what happened was really a transfer of the type of work that we had them do, not necessarily the elimination of their jobs. And I think, in my mind, that's what would happen with automated vehicles. I could still see the need for a person to be involved in that vehicle, but that role may change dramatically from driving the bus to fare collection and enforcement to dealing with unanticipated emergencies that occur on the vehicle and things of that nature, a much more customer-friendly, customer-focused approach than the traditional operating the vehicle approach.
Okay. Leanne, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, and just to take a step, I think, back from sort of getting to this fully autonomous vehicle state, I think that there's lots of opportunity, though, that this technology, the elements of this technology can present in the transit space, as they are already providing to all of us with our, my car has the backup thing. It freaks out if I change lanes too fast. But those technologies can help even in the public transport space in terms of improving safety and efficiencies even in the operations. I think that there's the smarter the vehicles become too, it can help on the maintenance side, so you can get more operating efficiencies out of the actual operations of the vehicle in your fleet, extend the life of the fleet. So I think, sometimes when we have these conversations, we a lot of times jump to sort of, stage 5 or
right,
5, whatever they refer to it as.
Suddenly 20 years ahead. Right.
But the components along the way, I think, are also as advantageous to us in the transit space to help us create safety and efficiencies as well. And I think that shouldn't be lost sight of. I think that some of that technology exists and is already presenting some benefits for us.
And I agree with that. In fact, we are already starting to integrate that kind of technology into our buses and trains even as we speak. So there will be benefits that we'll get from the technology as it develops that will start, what you see in your cars today, you'll start to see appearing in my buses in the future that will allow us to operate them more safely and more efficiently.
Okay, thank you. We don't have anyone from Metra on the panel, but this is something that, they're already incorporating positive train control, which is, they still require the engineer on the train, but this is an extra bit of safety in case a problem happens with the engineer. And so it's already happening here on the Metra system and on the freight system. John Basic, I wanted to ask you about funding changes in the roads to make them safe for autonomous vehicles or make them safer for even partially autonomous vehicles. One of the things that I keep hearing as a subject of conversation is, well, what if the lines aren't painted white enough, or what if the curbs aren't high enough? What kind of conversations are you having at IDOT about that?
Yeah, we are certainly hearing more and more about what the industry is demanding, really, to be able to make those technologies most effective. We are hearing things about wider pavement marking lines, having actually equipment, electronic equipment in traffic signals to be able to make them be able to talk to the vehicles, a vehicle to object, or so that when those vehicles are approaching those intersections, they like there was a description or a discussion in the previous panel talking about the two vehicles coming at an intersection and being able to talk to all of them through an intersection. So what does that look like? We're still learning about what those technologies could be for those connected components. But as far as like roadway safety, making sure that as we rebuild, for example, I-80, that's been a lot of discussion, I-290, making sure that those roadways are provided with wide lanes or wider lanes to be able to make sure that they're well delineated, making sure that things like having fiber optics throughout the entire network, which sounds like such a simple thing, but there are still gaps. There are still areas that don't have that fiber, which could be then used as a conduit to provide that connectivity and connected vehicle, autonomous vehicle technology to be able to communicate with other vehicles and other things within the infrastructure. So we are continuing to learn about that, and given that we're going to be having more money to be able to more sustainable maintain, rebuild a lot of our system, but maintain it more in a more frequent and meaningful fashion. So we also, as part of our maintenance program last year, we implemented a transportation and asset management plan, a TAMP plan, which then will allow us to do more improvements to our roadways, make them more smooth, more safe, more frequently. So doing more frequent maintenance, which would then, by having that system in place, that'll allow us to provide those better pavement markings, better lane delineations and delineators to make sure that they are in good working order to allow those connected vehicles, those autonomous vehicles to be able to work in an environment that is at an optimum condition.
Thank you. And following up on that, how about the differences between rural and urban and suburban driving? Are you going to have enough money to put all those changes into place in country roads in southern Illinois the same way you are going to be able to do up by I-80 by Joliet?
No. I think there is an opportunity there, though. Aaron brought it up. I think it's been talked about, in the previous panel. Cities may have, a different, set of technologies or whatever, different players may be involved in the more urban areas. So whatever that technology is here may not need to be the same as it is out in a more rural area. So it may be less intense. So maybe that is something that the state can, with fiber connections and things like that, provide those rural areas with some technology component that can provide some level of connection and I guess, ability for those autonomous vehicles to work in that environment that is similar because but yet different to the urban, because the urban area has just so much more inputs and there's so much more going on that in a rural area you wouldn't see that. So it could provide the same level, but it's contextually different. So I think we are going to work with the communities, the cities. And cities like Joliet may be one of those areas, but in between, what does it look like in between there? That's where we can kind of fill those gaps.
Okay, thank you. John?
Yeah, so, I know that just again, sitting through the panel previously, you had the private sector saying government better get their act together. And what we don't want to come across is as if we have really, the answers to the questions that we've got to be able to, obviously most important, as John said, it's all about the safety. Privacy is a big deal. We heard the gentleman talk about the fact that perhaps allowing a permitted pole to go up, a wireless 5G pole, is now perhaps causing some radiation challenges. It's all back on government. But all that being said, I think the point that what we want to say is we're very open to really embracing the private sector, looking for a non-for-profit like CMAP to convey us together. And we've been doing this, as John said earlier, for about a couple years now, where even with the transit agencies sitting down saying, we want to engage the private sector to try to understand what is it. We talked about pavement marking, but there's 20 different types of pavement markings out there. Is it got to be a certain type? Well, we don't have those answers. And yesterday I was speaking to the folks, at the dinner that we might even get beyond pavement mark. We don't care about your pavement mark. We don't care if you got curb and gutter, rural cross section. These are all things that government will take years to catch up, and technology will pass us by. So truth be told, I think that's the thing we can say, Tollway, IDOT, is we were engaging the community. We have to understand the private sector's role and responsibility. You got to understand government's liability part of this too. And somehow we really do believe we've got to get this right. And we are engaging in those conversations for a couple years now.
Okay, thank you. I actually wanted to ask everyone on the panel this related question. What have you heard from the private sector as far as what would they like to do? What would they like to see? Like start off from the tollway. What is the private sector telling you they'd like to see to make ready for autonomous vehicles? Amy?
Yeah, they certainly want to be able to start using our infrastructure for piloting opportunities, and I think John brought that up, and I think that it's important, it behooves us to be able to engage in those conversations in a way that ensures public safety first and foremost, but two, to be able to begin to have these incremental discussions with them about, again, what are they looking for? What sort of cooperation are they needing from public agencies like the tollway, so that they can start incrementally learning what their own capabilities are and also informing us too of what those capabilities are. I think that's the challenge with CAV technologies, that innovation is really being pushed from the private sector side, and for obvious reasons, there's a race to get their products out to market. We don't really know how quickly these things are going to come to market and what their capabilities are. So we know that they would like to start piloting these things. We'd like to engage in those conversations and really learn more about where they're going with these things.
Are you telling them, what are you telling them? No, not now, but let's keep talking?
Let's have a dialogue.
Okay.
Let's see what it is you want to do.
Okay, thank you. Dorval, what has the CTA heard from the private sector as far as this technology?
I would agree with what Amy was saying, is that what I'm hearing is, technology is moving much faster, innovation is happening much faster than the public sector is used to interacting with it. And so what they're looking for are ways to engage us. We are burdened with procurement procedures and other things that are very much set up in a traditional way of the public agency knowing what it wants, going out and asking for it, and then seeing who responds to it. Well, technology and the way innovation is happening right now, in many instances, we don't know what we don't know. And so one of the things that we've been hearing a lot about is there a way for us to bring ideas and concepts to you, to work with you, to develop them, to sort of have an opportunity to pilot and to try things? And how do I work through the bureaucracy that exists around a public agency to even find out who to talk to around those issues? One of the reasons why I recently created a new position at CTA called the Chief Innovation Officer was to create an ombudsman within CTA who could actually help companies sort of navigate CTA to understand where to work with us to develop technology, and also to make a broader point to the technology world and innovators in this world that CTA is open for business. I recognize that if I want to be relevant 20 years from now, I have to be prepared to innovate and to really think outside the box, to really reimagine what public transportation is going to look like in the future. But I'm not going to do that on my own. I really need the private sector, who is spending much more time and energy, thinking about this than I am, because I'm trying to run a bus and train system every day, to come to us with these ideas so we can figure out ways to incorporate them into what we do, so that we are able to provide the type of reliability, the improvement in quality, the efficiencies that the public expects of our public transit system as we continue to grow and evolve.
Okay, thank you. John, what are is with the private sector? You've been working with them. I know that there's a test track going on in Rantoul.
Yeah, I don't know where that is, in the development process. I think it's basically it's a partnership with the University of Illinois, some private sector partners. That's very early in the process, but it's something that we're working towards happening. And it may take a while. Government is a little slow sometimes to react and to kind of get things kind of worked out, but it will happen, and we will be having those discussions and those piloting opportunities. Something that that I was thinking about while Amy was talking about with industry. There's a significant push right now, and it's affecting all communities. The city of Chicago, rural, urban, is the 5G development and implementation, making sure that there's 5G micro towers on all sorts of infrastructure, blanketing communities and things like that. So I think that the 5G technology is going to be presumably a fundamental component of that connected autonomous vehicle and other connected, everything discussion. So that's probably, that's going to be something that we're, very involved with and are right now very involved with. There has been some discussion. And it was actually touched on in another question about would autonomous vehicles benefit from having dedicated lanes and things like that. And I think there has been some, modest discussion about, having expressways that might have like a managed lane component. People have talked about the Kennedy. It's got these reversibles. Are things like reversible lanes or having managed lanes? Are those potential opportunities to provide a platform for autonomous vehicles to be able to utilize in a mixed use environment? And we've talked about the lane pavement markings. John mentioned it. It's like, that is something that seems to be important now, but then other entities perhaps think it to be less important as more technology goes and is developed. But I think another thing that some of the industry, private sector would be interested in is the information, what information we have, whether it's our traffic signal, the way they operate, and how they're synchronized with other signals, and our traffic data collection. I think they would have some interest in some of that. But how to share that information in a way, and what the standards are, and the protocol for that has yet to be developed. And do they really even need it? I mean, at the end of the day, will they have essentially more information than what we can even provide because of connected vehicles, personal cell phones, and all those other things? So, but we're willing and bottom line, we're willing and wanting to work with them as we move forward.
Okay, thank you. Leanne, what have you heard from the private sector? Do they want information, or do they want to propose a scheme?
I think we're hearing everything that everyone's sort of already reiterated, so I won't belabor that. I guess my sort of takeaway from that is, though, it's sort of, or a translation of that is, it's not an us versus them or a them versus us. I think we are coming, the public and the private sector come at this very differently. It's sort of a clash of cultures maybe, and I think sometimes we're talking past each other. But I think what we have to do is continue a dialogue and an understanding of what we're all trying to accomplish. I think that, we have, in the public side, have very separate and distinct goals and outcomes that we need. I mean, we're here to protect the public interest, to protect equity, safety first and foremost. We're not here to make a dollar. But we, on the public side, have to understand sort of the role and the motivation of the private guys and the innovation and what they can bring to the table for us. And so we have to sort of find, I think, through continued conversation, a way to bring us together so we're not sort of talking past each other, that we can reach some of these mutual understandings and sort of advance a set of collective goals. And I think a lot of that has to get driven by the policy conversations that we have to continue to have. I know the private guys, especially in the technology space, kind of think that's laborious and slow, but I don't think we should just give up on sort of the place that we all have built and exist in, the cities, the suburbs, the communities and towns that we've built, and just sort of throw our hands up and say, just let it, complete disruption take over. I think we have to be mindful about, are we creating the kinds of places that people want to live, work, and play in?
Okay, thank you. Leanne, I wanted to follow up by asking about a project that I've written about with the RTA about Bannockburn, where you had a combination of the private sector with Lyft and the public sector with Metra as finding a way to get people where they're going.
Yeah, we've done some pilots. That's more in sort of the ride-hailing services space, but partnering in the suburban environment, some of the less dense areas, to provide connectivity from an end of a metro line on a reverse commute, connecting into some of the suburban campuses. And we've got a couple of pilots actually running and hoping to expand that further. Again, to kind of just monitor, learn, see how they evolve. And could they, as the technologies come online, could autonomous vehicles play in that space as well? And I think some of the tests that we've seen around the country, in some of those less dense campus environments, lend themselves well to earlier stages of autonomous and connected vehicles. So I think that there's, again, opportunities for us as well as sort of some challenges that I think we need to think through.
Okay, thank you. And John, what kind of, what has the county heard from the?
That really, the rules of the road, it's the state that dictates that. And on the policy side, they're just asking for counties, municipalities, transit service boards. Are we all working together on creating a policy that's consistent? What they don't want is having to deal with municipal challenges with legislation that they'll decide to pass, then counties, ordinances, then other state laws, and all of that just making it impossible for them. So they've just asked if we would just all collaborate. And I know, again, the question earlier about CMAP and the role that they can play and the opportunities that we really have with, Erin Alleman, who, when she was over at the state, was one of the leaders in that autonomous space that was convening this region's units of government, DOTs, and transit. And so with her role now over at CMAP, we really believe that we are working close together. And under her leadership, I think we really can kind of give exactly what that private sector is looking to do, is just to have policy that really does deal with state, local, municipal type of ordinances and regulations. So that's what they constantly ask, is when they see us, and it's like, have you talked to the state? What about your municipalities? Are you all together? And at least I think I can, with a good conscience, say we really are collaborating in the space. And all of us here, we've seen each other in different venues that have said the same thing about how policy needs to be crafted. So I think we're answering that question the right way, and that's kind of what they've been asking.
Well, since we're in a university, and there's lots of university types here, I wanted to ask because this is this is a futuristic discussion. What sorts of things, what kind of support would you like to see from universities to help you learn about how to handle this new technology? And this is a question I'm throwing open to anyone.
Well, let me speak to that, because I think there's the benefit of a city like Chicago is that we have a very rich higher learning education core that sits in the city. And to be able to tap into that core to help bring new ideas that focus on new technology and new ways that we can integrate public transit using new technology, I think is a tremendous opportunity for us. And I know that there are projects that UIC is working on where they're basically collaborating with agencies like mine and saying, we're going to turn our students loose on you. And I say that in a very positive way. And say, tell us what your problems are and let us help you figure out how we can support you. And when I talk about thinking outside the box and really viewing what we do from a different lens, I think that's what universities teach their students to do. It's part of the education process. And so we have a tremendous resource in Chicago that allows us to use that. And I think the issue is, how do we basically tap into that resource in a way that can bring ideas to us and can allow us to develop those ideas in ways that support what we try to do every day.
Okay, so you hear that? He's open.
I'm open.
Okay. Anyone else on the university role?
Well, from an Illinois DOT side, We've certainly partnered and have, historically partnered with University of Illinois, Chicago, as well as Champaign. And I think that that's going to be a continual partnership. But this opens up a whole new opportunity to do it a lot more aggressively. And it's not just a partner with the university, but we somehow need to also bring in the private sector, because they're going to be providing the latest and greatest strategies, the approaches, and having the ability of having students provide input and help develop that, bridging that gap between the technology and where maybe it, boots on the ground kind of stuff, I think is going to be very, very critical for our success, and that could help develop and start the development and the conversation of those policies that need to be in place for all this to work going forward.
Okay, thank you. Any Star Trek fans here in this panel? Okay. I wanted to go on a vision quest.
Okay, where are you going with this question?
Well, now 20 years ago, we were using tokens at the CTA. We were doing things a lot differently. We weren't seeing scooters all over the place. We were seeing a lot of things that are different, and we were seeing a lot of the things that are the same. I'm wondering if everyone in the panel can just kind of imagine, what do you think the roads and the systems of the Chicago area are going to look like in 20 years with autonomous vehicles? And I'm going to start over here with Amy. What do you think this is going to look like?
20 years, technology will absolutely be completely different, but I don't see our region really changing that much land use wise. And so I do think that people will still be coming from a lot of the same places that they'll be. So I think it's more about how they navigate the tollway system and hopefully start thinking more intermodally as they navigate the overall transportation system.
Okay, thank you. Which next generation?
All of them.
All of them, yeah.
What I think you're going to see is better integration. Technology is going to allow the seamless integration between various modes of transportation, for which public transportation will be the backbone, but where you'll be able to get into a car. The car will take you to a CTA station, but not only will it take you there, it'll basically coordinate your ride in a way that when you arrive there, the train will be pulling to the station. The train will know to wait because there's a car arriving that the person's going to be getting on to take that train to go to a different location where they will take an Uber or a Lyft or something like that to complete their destination. What I think you're going to see is that these various modes will start to integrate into a mobility ecosphere that's going to allow the people who live in this city to have the seamless ability to move between one mode of transportation to another in a way that provides the most convenient and most efficient method of travel for what they're trying to do. Right now, we're all operating sort of independent of each other, and we rely on the person to figure out how to integrate us. When we're at a point where the person basically doesn't have to worry about that, it's all taken care of for them, I think that's when you really have reached another level of mobility that will tie in automated vehicles, it'll tie in ride hailing, it'll tie in scooters and everything else in a way that allows us to make it as easy as possible for people to get around the city.
Okay, and not a dystopian future. That sounds nice. Okay, John, what do you think? What's it going to look
not
like?
teleporting, but.
Okay.
Yeah, well, the first thing, the transportation system will be dramatically safer. I mean, we will, right now we've got a drive to zero fatalities, and, that seems like it's real. I mean, it's a possibility. I could see urban areas like the city of Chicago, there might be a day or time where there might still be, and there likely will be, vehicles, like personal cars. People will still have their classic cars, but they might have to go out to the country to drive. If you're going to come in towards the city, maybe you drive to a certain point and maybe jump into an autonomous vehicle at the fringe of a city, and maybe the city itself is primarily public transit, autonomous vehicles, because with the mix of the mode, the vast variety of modes, having autonomous vehicles in the city is probably that's maybe the only way all of that can work together. So there's that possibility. So yeah, I think that's, but and also actually, and in between that, the safety doesn't necessarily just benefit the city. It benefits even in the suburbs, because even where there are people driving their own cars, having a dense mix of autonomous vehicles is going to likely result in increased safety of the roadways as well, harmonizing speeds and things like that. So, yeah, I do believe it's coming in 20 years. It'll be very, very different, as Amy alluded. Yeah, the technology will be it's unimaginable in my.
Okay, so another positive view. Leanne, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm not going dystopian either. I'm going positive. But I agree with everything that's been said already. I guess an additional point that I would highlight is I think this interconnectivity and this access to information, and I think this is an underpinning of all of that, is this sort of shared economy that we're already kind of living in some respects, but as Dorval said, it's sort of still a little bit disconnected. As it becomes even more connected, both I think as much, not just connected vehicles, but just information connectivity, I sort of see this real opportunity for sort of people just choosing to go somewhere and less ownership of individual vehicles. I won't need to have a car to get to the train station. I'll just hit something on my phone or whatever device I have. Maybe it's just embedded into my brain at that point. But and the vehicle will show up, or it will actually predict that this is probably the time. I mean, Google's already playing with some of this stuff, predicting that you've seen on your own phone. It gets in and it thinks it's like, okay, drive time to work, which annoys me because I always take transit, but it tells me what it would take me to drive to work every day because it knows it's about the time that I'm now moving, so I'm probably going to work. So you take that to the next level, and I think that there's some real opportunities, though, so people will get away from the individual, privately owned vehicle, more of a shared economy, and I think that's even a bigger boost for a broader public transportation network. It really has to underpin all of that. But it's all about the choices.
I think that's a really important point, because we're not just talking about autonomous vehicles as being a technology on their own. There's all this other technology that's happening at the same time, changes in the way we work, the way we go to work, changes in the way we organize our time, and all the different tools that are helping us or making things worse for organizing our time. Leanne, I wanted to follow up with, because your agency handles the budgets for PACE, which handles the ADA transportation. I wondered if you could address how you think that AV would incorporate and may possibly improve transportation for the disabled.
Actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that there's a huge opportunity for smart vehicles, autonomous vehicles in sort of the ADA space, but even just more importantly, I mean, younger people who can't drive a car now. Like, I don't know, I kind of keep babysitters around just to get my kids to and from after school activities sometimes, to be able to put them in a car that gets them there safely would be, or a vehicle that gets them there safely would be great. But elderly, I mean, my parents are getting to that age where, my mother's eyesight, her ability to drive is going to go away. So being still connected to community and things she wants to do, I think, these are beyond even just the, strict limits of ADA. I think the opportunities really are very exciting, I think, for everybody as a community, and our ability to sort of continue to function and move around the spaces, as Amy said, to sort of get to where you want to go to work, live, and play.
Okay, thank you. John?
Yeah, so I think your question, tying that into the earlier question about academia. So in January, UIC hosts the Future Cities competition that brings out, the smartest of the smartest grade school kids that get a chance to design a city of the future. And as one of the judges for the last 7 years, to come out and ask the question, when you see their little displays, and it's in this room that they put those out there, and you see that very few of them really design roads anymore. And what's great is when you ask some of these students, where are the roads in your system? And unfortunately, a lot of times I judge the design of the roadway, and they're like, sir, there's no roads in my future city. And so that's where I really believe and agree with everything that was said, is that even though we just passed the Capitol bill, there still isn't enough money to rebuild the built infrastructure in and around the Chicagoland area, Cook County. So there is going to be less roads, and the need to really drive for that type of real equitable, getting around, connecting with people, connecting with one another in the places we work, play, And that's what I think that these kids got it right. There's going to be less roads in the future.
Okay, thank you. I was wondering to, thank you so much for everything, all these thoughtful comments, and I wondered if I could open it up for questions. Does anyone have any questions for this distinguished panel? I don't know where the mic person is, but. Oh, here comes the mic, so wait. Everyone wants to hear your question. So thank you.
Yeah, actually, I mean, we are at a critical point in the transportation history, and the public policies we implement now are going to be critical for this generation as well as the future generation. And I know you are talking about partnership with private industries, and I mean, their goal is to maximize their profits. And the government goal should be to maximize the benefits of the current generation as well as the future generation. And I'm saying this because, you know, private industries will influence the policies through their lobbying and other things. If you look at the last century, for example, a lot of automakers, apparently people say influenced, so that the public transportation is inhibited. And that's why we have all these sprawling suburbs and so many cars driving. So how can we prevent and make sure that it is the public good of this current generation as well as the future generation that is taken into consideration, that is the main focus, not the profits of the private industry?
Okay, thank you. So the question, how can we protect the public in this, in this new age? Anyone?
Well, I think,
thank you.
You know, Leanne, I think, mentioned this earlier about the role that public agencies play in this conversation, and you're absolutely right that we have a broader responsibility to society than just making money. You know, the equity issues, the access issues, the broader societal benefits that come from, at least in my case, public transit, are a part of what should be in the dialogue as the policymakers start to approach what are the policies that are going to support this type of innovation going forward. You know, one of the things that I found interesting, and it's, I think you've heard thematically this being mentioned by all the panelists here today, is there's a lot of money being spent on the technology side of this conversation. You know, rushing to get to level 5 AV and basically starting to figure out how we get there. There's not nearly the same amount of resources being spent on how municipalities, states, county government, and other agencies are going to basically integrate all this technology into our society. And that's something that we all need to be wary of, because this technology is coming, we all agree with that, and it's going to get here, and the real issue is, are we ready to integrate it into our cities and our states and our counties? And there's the same level of preparation that needs to happen on that side of the house that's happening on the technology side of the house. And so the real issue for us is who's really leading that effort, where are the resources coming from to help us answer the questions that we're all talking about here about what exactly is this going to look like, and how do we make the trade-offs between equity, quality of life, efficiency, congestion, air quality, livability in general. There are trade-offs and compromises that have to happen around all of this, and who's going to figure that out, and how are we going to make it work in the city of the future? And I think we as the public agency have that responsibility, and then we have to figure out how we're going to integrate what the private sector wants to bring to us in a way that's still going to accomplish those other broader societal goals that we have viewed as critical to the way in which we operate and behave on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, thank you. Over here? Oh, I'm sorry, go over here. Okay, thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, before you, go ahead.
It's okay. I appreciate the productive visionary discussion. You know, the question I have, though, is about, you said it's going to happen over the next 20 years, which is really not that long of a time. It's cost, and the financing of this cost. You know, when you things you've mentioned here, those numbers can run up pretty big. In Illinois, you know, we do have a lot of debt, a lot of pension debt. And I'm wondering about the squeeze, how we're going to pay for this. Where's it going to come from? Who's going to pay? How much is it private? How much is it public? You know, what are you going to do it? And are there cost estimates right now that you can share with us in some way that maybe talk about perhaps a phase or an example or an illustration doing the Eisenhower Expressway? I just want to hone in on this because in Illinois, we better start saving for it.
Okay, thank you. Amy, when you were putting the smart technology into I-90, how big a part of the cost of the building of that road was that?
Yeah, I actually don't have the number right off the top of my head, but I'd kind of like to pose the question back to you. What is it that you think that we're pricing out? What are the scope of improvements? I actually think that we, in this age of data sourcing, cloud sourcing, things like that, that we have an opportunity to offset the costs that we have in putting out devices, collecting all this information about congestion and speed and where incidences are happening on our roadways. We have an opportunity to offset that cost and maybe go to a Google and ask them, why don't you tell us that, instead of us investing in millions of dollars of putting those devices out there, maintaining them, and having to change them out every 10 years. So I think the door is still sort of wide open on that question. We don't know what it is that these technologies could present to us in terms of cost or benefit. But you know, what I will say is we have begun a very low-budget, small-scale connected vehicle pilot along I-90. We've installed 8 different DSRC devices out on I-90 over about a 10-mile stretch. I think it's totaling us right now $100,000.
And I guess I'd just add to it, I don't necessarily think it's the public sector or the public agency's role to be that innovator. I think it's our role is to maybe incorporate some of these technologies as we're making other improvements once they've been recognized, tested, and sort of, I mean, we can still get in the space of testing and piloting, but you know, we shouldn't, because we're sort of much more in charge or charged with overseeing sort of this broader public good, if you will, to steal a true economics term, you know, I don't think it's our responsibility to sort of be too cutting edge on this stuff and sort of, but incorporating things as we're making other improvements. Another point that a couple of us have touched on is set pensions aside, I don't want, that's too much of a political conversation, but just from a basic infrastructure standpoint, the need for investment across the existing infrastructure that we have, that even as it gets smarter and needs to be upgraded, you still have to have this core-based infrastructure, and you know that's billions and billions of dollars in of itself. And even with this unprecedented state capital program, you know, I'll just speak from the transit standpoint. It doesn't get us. If we just get this capital program and in 5 years' time do nothing beyond that, it's just a blip on the radar and makes basically no difference to the state of the condition of our assets. And in a sense, we'd be sort of ignoring the billions that have already been invested into this infrastructure that we have. So we have to be kind of protective and mindful of that, incorporating, I think, some of this technology as we make improvements. You buy your phone dies, you don't just buy the flip phone, you upgrade it, it gets new enhancements, new features. And that's what we do in the public sector, but we're not really going to be driving some of that. So I don't think it's our job to price what that cost is going to be. I think that's somewhat the private sector bringing some of those resources to the table and pricing them appropriately, that we can start incorporating some of those so it's a cost benefit in terms of efficiencies and safety and things like that. So.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank
you
you.
know, and I would just piggyback on that. You know, the reality is that the future roadways that we maybe even rebuild just for condition, you know, issues that may not require some of the stuff that we consider today smart. I mean, we know if putting gantries along the expressway today is you know, probably the most progressive that we have as a technology for highways now, but in 5 or 10 years, with all the information that Google provides or all these, you know, all the providers, they might not need gantries to be able to tell you up ahead that there's an incident. I actually know that now. If I use Waze or Google, it'll tell me there's something going on, get off the road and do something else. So, you know, there is the potential that there's less investment in our infrastructure to some degree to make that happen. But you know, but foundationally, we still need, at least for the next time being, some roads. Maybe in some future there won't be a need for roads, but there's still a lot of stuff. And there's bridges that are in bad shape. There's drainage that needs to be improved, and there's a lot of things that need to be upgraded along the way, regardless of the connected vehicle and technology component. So.
It sounds like it's the approach like that CDOT takes now. We're going to redo this road, so while we're here, why don't we add a bike lane? Or while we're here, why don't we add some technology that's going to help with autonomous vehicles, or prepare for a technology that's coming, as well as improving the technology we have. So, and see if the public sector can pay for any of it, or private sector can pay for any of it along the way. Another question. Where's the mic lady? Right here?
Gotta stand up.
Yes, sir.
Thanks. I wanted to just bring in another sort of public good aspect of thinking about this, which is public health, and in particular, people walking. So the kind of descriptions of the 20-year future, I have to say, scared me a little bit, because it seemed like the car is going to deliver you to the CTA, and then the CTA is going to take you somewhere. Another car is going to pick you up. But I think we know one of the big advantages of people taking public transit is that they actually are walking more. And I just want to make sure that gets into the conversation, and just how much can you think about that?
Well, we've got to go, the Onto 2050 plan that Erin talked about before, and we all participate and actually sit at that table sort of talking about and planning that future. And walking is a huge component of that sort of the space, the physical space that we, and the livability of a space that we will engage in. I think you're exactly right. I mean, I think we're just skipping over that just because of the purpose of this conversation was more.
The question was more about what kind of future do I see around automated vehicles and connectivity, but especially someone like public transit, we definitely see walking as a big part of that process. And I think there's also another, broader societal issue around sort of what we're talking about, which is isolationism. There's a benefit to society that there are places that we gather together as a group and we interact as a group. And public transit is one of the ways in which that happens. The more you start to segregate that out, the more you have people in their individual cars and less interaction with others. I think there's a broader loss that occurs to our society as a whole as a result of that. That, while not necessarily a, quote, transportation issue, I think is part of the broader policy conversation that has to happen about sort of what do we want the future of our city to look like.
Maybe a good point. Someone else in the back there? Two people in the back? There you go.
Thanks. Mary, you brought up this point about how when CDOT redoes a road, they add in bike lanes and stuff like that. Now, IDOT controls many arterial streets in Chicago. I wonder if they're thinking about maybe partnering with the CTA, adding in bus lanes, bike lanes, maybe thinking a little more broadly about the purposes of the streets while they're rebuilding them for AVs.
Yeah. You want me to
Go ahead. That's a little off the topic of AV, but that's okay. Let's get into it.
I mean, the reality is that we do coordinate, partner. We have stakeholder coordination meetings with including the city, CTA, PACE. We talk about, actually IDOT has a complete streets policy. It's kind of on the heels of the city's longer term complete streets policy. But yeah, biking, walking, are certainly foundational to all of our infrastructure planning as we're going forward. And we do and have implemented bike lanes and things like that. We're still kind of evolving, I guess, a little bit, and we're doing more of it, but we're still, we've got a lot more opportunities that we're going to continue to do that as we improve our roadways going forward. So yeah, we do that, and we are, it's an important component in our planning.
One area where that's happening right now, in terms of real time, is on North Lakeshore Drive, where there's a conversation that's happening about rebuilding the drive, but it's not just a conversation around rebuilding it for cars. There's a discussion about buses, how they should be integrated into that rebuild, bike lanes, parkland, all of that is a part of that whole corridor conversation in which I think the IDOT has really taken the lead and sort of working through that conversation and sort of determining what ultimately is the best way to approach the travel needs of that part of the city along that corridor.
Okay, and then there was another question here. Thank you.
Hello. I'm interested in your public outreach strategy and trying to determine how to best address the tensions between complexity and simplicity. For a long time, a regional transportation model said that a truck was the equivalent of 2 cars, which impacts certainly aren't that. And trying to assure that the public is aware of the complexity of these technologies and how far out some of these technologies may be at the moment, and trying to allay their concerns about what their impacts are, as well as how to assure that their expectations are in line with what is likely to happen.
Okay, thank you. I think there are some concerns from the public about the impact of AVs and new technology. How, we've seen some, there's many tragedies every year from regular cars, but there's also been a few high-profile ones of autonomous cars. How do we talk to the public about that? We'll start, anyone? We have to be ready. How do you reassure them?
Well, I think it's just the continued conversation on, panels like this, education with the public at large, elected officials, the engagement that we collectively do with CMAP, talking about sort of the vision for the future and all the subsequent components of that. I think that is just an ongoing conversation to understand sort of what this is, what this isn't. You just talk to somebody on the street, they don't necessarily even think that elements of autonomous vehicles already exist.
Right.
When you go, well, hang on, do you have that backup assist? And you go, oh yeah. They don't necessarily haven't connected that to this sort of robotic, fully automatic vehicle roaming the streets. But you talk to a 12-year-old and they sort of assume that just is the norm for the future. So, I think we've got to sort of speak to multiple audiences, multiple generations and understanding, and I think that's just, and policymakers, elected officials too, helping them understand what this all looks like.
Yeah, and we have to have an elevator pitch here that they are the future of safety. And because, again, we know there's some sensational, stories that are out there. Statistically, the accidents on the expressway system this morning's commute, 3-4 accidents per morning commute, another 2 or 3 are the average. This technology is going to make things safer.
Yeah. Okay, and on that positive note, I would like to thank all of our panelists, Amy Lee from the Tollway, Dorval Carter from the CTA, John Basic from IDOT, Leanne Redden from the RTA, and John Yonan from Cook County. Thanks for staying.
Thank you all. Thank you to the panel, and thank you to the moderators, Jerry Quant and to Mary Wisniewski. Big round of applause for both of them, as well as for the keynote speakers and everyone else who participated either here or over there. Thank you all for being here, making time today for an engaged discussion. A lot of questions were asked. A lot of answers were provided. And as academics and researchers, we have the burden on us to take this forward and move the dialogue towards some kind of convergence as we move into the future. And this is not the end of the Urban Forum for this year. Before you get startled, there's going to be a second phase of this. If you look at your program, there are 4 authors who have written white papers for us on this particular topic area. They'll be coming back to the campus at a later point this semester, maybe during the month of November. And we'll keep you posted. If you're interested in the topic further, do let us know. We can engage you and keep you posted about their arrivals to the campus so you can take part in those discussions. And one of the things that we would like is there's this feedback form. Please do fill this out. As academics, we look at this data and see how we can improve ourselves. So can kind of humor us with that. And one of the other things that I wanted to do is to take this opportunity to thank a whole bunch of people who made this possible. When we first met back in January, I think, I was told that the deadline for the final program should be sometime in June or July. Of course, true to fashion, I pulled us along till the last minute, in fact, till yesterday afternoon. And they were nimble enough and fleet-footed, and they were able to accommodate to our whimsical ways of programming this event and made this a grand success. So Jenny Sweeney, Brian Flood, Ed Berry, Taylor, Carla, and Norma Ramos, and if I'm missing out on anyone, the Dean Pagano, for being the fearless leader. And so all of this came together at the right moment and made this a complete event, in my opinion. I hope you felt the same way. If you didn't, here's your chance. Let us know. And we'll try to improve on ourselves for next year. That's the whole game. And of course, there's lunch. I'm sure someone will point you or follow the smells, and you'll get to lunch. Do let us know. And shameless plug for the Urban Transportation Center that I have the privilege of heading. We are in our 40th year. We'll be doing some event to commemorate that. If you're curious to know about that, or if you are curious to know about what we do, go to our website, follow us on Facebook, check with Ed Berry, who goes on this Twitter thing and tweets out. And so be engaged. Let us know how we can do more work that is resonating with you. And with that, I'll close this event, and then thank you all.